In ancient times, cats were worshipped as gods. They have not forgotten this. Terry Pratchett. Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Take a moment, wherever you are, to quiet yourself. Let your mind ease into the rhythm of slow storytelling. Maybe you're here because you're winding down before bed, or maybe you're cooking, working, or even listening on headphones while the world carries on around you. However you use this time, this space is for you. This channel is for calm science, not wild speculation, not loud drama, just the humble story of what we know and what we are still learning. We don't always have the answers, but we do our best to trace the evidence and follow the science. If you happen to drift off in the middle of one of these chapters, don't worry. I've put timestamps in the description, so the next day you can pick up exactly where you left off, because the whole story, from beginning to end, is worth it. If you find value in this kind of long-form, soft science storytelling, I'd ask you to please like and subscribe. It makes a real difference. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, let's step into tonight's story, how cats took over humanity, the entire history of cats with us. From the first time a wild hunter crept into a Mesopotamian granary 9,000 years ago, to the moment they curled up on our pillows today. What happens when the hunter of fields discovers human grain? Around 9,500 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, something small and unplanned began to unfold. A wildcat, Felis sylvestris libica, slipped into the edges of a farming village under the cover of night. It was not there to watch humans, it was there because humans had drawn its prey. Mice and rats, lured by baskets of barley and wheat, had found a new paradise in these settlements. And where rodents flourished, predators inevitably followed. The hunter of the fields crept closer, not knowing that by following its instincts, it was stepping into a partnership that would ripple forward through millennia. The people of the Neolithic were just learning how to bend plants to their will. Farming was not a single discovery, but a slow, uneven process across the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. By this time, they were already storing their harvest in woven reed baskets, clay bins, and earth-dug pits. These granaries were triumphs of early engineering, but they also broadcasted an irresistible signal across the landscape. Food, available year-round, in one place. Rodents moved in quickly, gnawing through storage containers, burrowing beneath foundations and leaving droppings among precious food stores. For the farmers, this was more than an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to survival. Without effective protection, months of work could be undone by swarms of small teeth. Enter the wildcat. These animals had lived for hundreds of thousands of years as solitary hunters across the deserts and grasslands of North Africa and Southwest Asia. Their bodies were built for ambush. Long legs, sharp reflexes, eyes adapted for twilight, and a patience that made them lethal in silence. To them, the first villages were not social curiosities but rodent magnets, concentrated hunting grounds unlike anything in the natural world. A granary, to a wildcat, was a predictable feeding site. Night after night they could return and find prey scurrying in the same narrow spaces, with no need to wander far across the savannah. What made this encounter remarkable was not that wildcats followed prey, but that humans allowed them to remain. Most predators were kept at bay, hunted or driven off. Wolves threatened livestock, leopards threatened people, jackals carried disease. Wildcats, in contrast, were small, independent, and critically useful. They ate what the humans feared most, the destroyers of grain. A silent negotiation began. Humans tolerated their presence. Wildcats learned that people, for all their noise and fire, were less dangerous than they seemed. The arrangement did not require trust or affection. It was a simple case of survival aligning on both sides. Archaeologists call this the commensal pathway to domestication. It is different from the pathways that shaped other animals. Sheep and goats were first hunted, then herded, then deliberately bred by humans. Dogs may have been drawn into camps earlier, but people actively selected them for tameness, for hunting ability, for loyalty. Cats, by contrast, drifted into human settlements under their own initiative. No one caught them and caged them. No one planned to breed them. They domesticated themselves by finding a niche in the human world and thriving in it. The humans benefited because their food was safer. The cats benefited because their prey was concentrated. Over generations, this fragile balance began to shape the population of cats around villages. The individuals bold enough to tolerate human presence had more access to rodents, and thus more opportunities to survive and reproduce. The shyest, most skittish wildcats stayed in the open fields and avoided humans altogether. Slowly, by nothing more than natural selection, the cats of the settlements became subtly different from those of the wild. They were not yet domestic in the modern sense, but they were adapting to a world of fires, noises, smells, and people. They were, in essence, learning to live with us. Archaeological traces from sites such as early Jericho and other Neolithic settlements suggest the scale of the rodent problem. Grain storage bins show gnaw marks. Rodent bones litter refuse pits. The cats themselves leave almost no direct evidence in this period, a silence that is telling in itself. They were not yet buried with humans, not yet worshipped or painted, not yet bred deliberately. They lived in the shadows, useful but unremarked, tolerated but not celebrated. That silence is part of their story. It tells us that this stage of domestication was not about affection or symbolism. It was about ecological necessity. From the perspective of science, this stage of the cat-human relationship is both compelling and frustrating. We know it happened because of later genetic evidence, and because of the patterns we see in how wildcats still behave today. Yet we lack clear fossil markers, unlike cattle or dogs, which show obvious morphological changes under domestication. Cats remain almost indistinguishable from their wild cousins. The bones of a Neolithic wildcat and those of a village-tolerant cat look almost the same. It is only through context, their presence in human settlements, the isotopic signatures of their diets, that we can glimpse the shift. The humbling part of this story is how little control humans had. We often tell domestication as a triumph, as though people bent animals to their will. In the case of cats, the evidence suggests otherwise. They came for the rodents, and they stayed because it suited them. People did not capture them or reshape them. They tolerated them, and in that tolerance the first threads of partnership were spun. It was at its root a relationship founded on convenience rather than command. And so the haunting question lingers. Who domesticated whom? Did humans domesticate cats by creating a new niche in which only tolerant individuals could thrive? Or did cats domesticate humans by making themselves so useful that we allowed them into our settlements, and eventually our lives? What began at the granaries of the Fertile Crescent was not a love story, not yet. It was something quieter, more ambiguous, but no less important. A partnership born of hunger and survival. From that delicate beginning, the long and complicated history of cats with us was set in motion. Who carried the first cat across the Mediterranean? Somewhere around 9,500 years ago, a small island tells us a great deal about the growing importance of these silent hunters. The island is Cyprus, lying just far enough from the mainland to require a deliberate sea voyage, and in its Neolithic soils lies one of the earliest direct pieces of evidence for a close human-cat relationship. Archaeologists working at the site of Chiluracambos uncovered a grave that changed the way we think about the beginnings of domestication. Within it, the body of a human had been carefully buried with offerings of stone tools and shells. Beside that body lay another, smaller skeleton, a young cat. This was not a coincidence of bones mixing in the soil. The cat was deliberately placed, aligned with the human, suggesting a shared interment. It is, as far as we know, one of the first clear cases of humans and cats being buried together, and the location matters enormously. Cyprus had no native wildcats. The African wildcat, ancestor of the domestic cat, lived on the mainland of Southwest Asia and North Africa. To reach the island, cats had to be brought there, carried in boats across open water. This was not a creature that wandered in of its own accord. It was transported, deliberately or incidentally, by people. That single grave hints at a profound shift. A wild predator that once circled human settlements on the mainland now rested in the ground beside a human companion, across the sea, in a land where it did not belong naturally. We cannot know whether this was an animal beloved in life, or a symbolic offering, or even part of a ritual. What we do know is that it was carried, and that matters. Moving a cat across the Mediterranean required effort and care. These are not animals known for their tolerance of confinement. To keep one alive during a sea journey, the people would have needed to bring food and water, and perhaps to handle it regularly enough that it did not simply flee or die in panic. That this happened at all suggests that cats were already seen as valuable, either for their ability to control vermin, or for reasons of companionship and symbolism that we cannot yet untangle. The Neolithic peoples of Cyprus were among the earliest agricultural colonists. They brought with them not just crops and tools, but whole suites of animals that did not exist on the island. Archaeological layers show the introduction of cattle, sheep, goats, and dogs. Cats joined this wave of transported life. In some sense, they were part of the Neolithic package, an unspoken companion species whose usefulness had already been recognised enough to merit inclusion. If the commensal pathway began with wildcats slipping silently into grain stores, then here we see the next step, people ensuring that cats travelled with them as they expanded into new lands. The burial itself is striking for its detail. The cat was about 8 months old, a juvenile but not a tiny kitten. Its skeleton shows no obvious sign of trauma, no marks of butchery, no indication that it was killed for food. Its placement alongside a human, complete with grave goods, suggests a level of association beyond mere utility. If the sole value of cats at this stage was pest control, we would not expect them to appear in ritual burials. This suggests cautiously that people had already begun to see them as something more. Perhaps they were admired for their stealth, or feared for their mystery, or simply valued as companions. We cannot be sure, but it is clear that by this point cats had stepped into a liminal role. Not livestock, not quite pets, but something closer to both than to wild predators. To understand how unusual this is, it helps to think about how rare deliberate animal burials are in this era. Most early animals appear in middens, the trash heaps of bones discarded after meals. Sheep and goats were eaten, their bones scattered in refuse pits. Dogs occasionally appear in burials, suggesting some special role as companions or guardians, but cats are exceptional. Their remains are scarce, and when they appear in this context, it tells us that they had already begun to occupy a distinctive cultural space. The Chiluracambos burial is thus not just an oddity. It is a marker of transition, a rare glimpse into a relationship that was slowly deepening. The logistics of transport cannot be ignored. Crossing from mainland Anatolia or the Levant to Cyprus in the Neolithic required boats capable of carrying people, animals and supplies. Cats would have been brought intentionally, whether as stowaways on grain-laden vessels or as creatures placed among the other domesticated animals. Either way, they were part of the human community that ventured across the sea. This makes sense when we recall the ecological logic. Grain stores attract rodents. Rodents destroy harvests. Cats keep rodents in check. Bringing cats across would have been as practical as bringing dogs or goats. Yet the burial reminds us that it was not only practicality at work. There was symbolism here, and perhaps emotion. What this symbolism meant is difficult to parse. In the absence of texts, we have only the bones and their arrangement. Was the cat seen as a spirit guardian, buried to protect the human in the afterlife? Was it a companion in life, laid to rest beside its owner? Was it a sacrificial animal, meant to accompany a soul into whatever lay beyond? Each of these interpretations has been proposed, and none can be proven. The honest answer is that we do not know. As scientists, we can describe the facts, the location, the skeletons, the dating to around 9,500 years ago. We can suggest possibilities, but we must admit that certainty eludes us, that humility is part of the story too. The Chiluracambos cat is not evidence of full domestication. Its bones look like those of a wildcat. There are no clear morphological changes. It did not have the genetic markers of the later domestic lineages. But it is evidence of human action. It shows us that cats were already being moved, already being valued, already being integrated into human lives in ways that went beyond the casual tolerance of earlier millennia. Here, on an island where they could not have arrived on their own, they appear as companions in burial. That is enough to tell us that something had shifted. There is also a haunting aspect to this story. Imagine the moment itself, a Neolithic funeral, a body carefully laid down, offerings placed beside it, and then, finally, a cat, small and silent, placed nearby. Did the mourners feel affection, or awe, or fear? Did they think of the cat as family, or as something liminal between human and spirit? The burial forces us to wonder not just about the practical side of domestication, but about the emotional and symbolic layers that we rarely glimpse in the archaeological record. This one grave does not stand alone. Other evidence from early Mediterranean sites suggests that cats were already dispersing along trade and migration routes. Later, we see them more clearly in Egypt and beyond. But here, in the early Neolithic of Cyprus, we can be sure of one thing. They were carried across the sea, valued enough to join the journey, and honoured enough to be buried alongside humans. That act, humble and enigmatic, is one of the clearest signs that cats were no longer just hunters at the edge of the firelight. They had begun to travel with us. The unresolved question is why? Why this animal? And why then? It is possible that the rodent problem was severe enough that bringing cats was simply common sense. It is possible that individual bonds had already formed, with people feeding and taming kittens until they became familiar presences in households. It is possible that cultural ideas were forming about cats as protectors or spiritual beings. We may never know which of these mattered most. What we do know is that from this point forward, cats were not confined to the mainland. They were voyagers with us, carried across the waters, folded into the story of human expansion. Which wildcat gave rise to every housecat alive today? To answer this, we must look back to the early Holocene, roughly 10,000 to 8,000 years before the present, in the heart of the Fertile Crescent. This was the cradle not only of agriculture, but of one of the most unlikely partnerships in natural history. The cats that stalk our living rooms and doze on our pillows all trace their lineage to a single ancestor, a subspecies of wildcat known as Felis sylvestris libica. Understanding this animal means understanding both the biological root of domestication and the slow merging of human and feline histories. The family Felidae, to which all cats belong, is ancient and widespread. Lions, tigers, leopards, cougars and domestic cats alike share a common ancestor that lived in Asia around 10 to 12 million years ago. Over the intervening ages, the family divided into the large roaring cats, known as Pantherini, and the smaller cats known as feline. Within this latter branch, several regional subspecies of the wildcat arose: the European wildcat, Felis sylvestris sylvestris, the African and Near Eastern wildcat, Felis sylvestris libica, the Central Asian wildcat, Felis sylvestris ornata, and others. To the casual eye, these wildcats are all similar, striped or sandy-coloured predators of small mammals. But genetic studies have revealed a crucial truth. All domestic cats alive today descend not from a mixture of these wildcats, but from one particular subspecies, Felis sylvestris libica, which ranged across North Africa and the Fertile Crescent. The evidence comes from mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through the maternal line. When scientists compared the DNA of modern housecats with that of various wildcats, they found a consistent match to libica, not to the European or Central Asian populations. This means that every domestic cat on Earth, whether curled up in a Paris apartment or prowling through an American barn, is ultimately the descendant of Near Eastern wildcats that began their relationship with humans in the cradle of agriculture. This is a humbling reminder of how narrow the genetic bottleneck can be. Out of the many possible small cats in the world, one lineage seized the opportunity presented by human settlement and spread globally as a result. What did libica look like, and why was it the one that crossed into our lives? The Near Eastern wildcat is slightly larger than a typical housecat, with long legs, a slender body, and a coat of pale sandy brown, often streaked with faint stripes. It is nocturnal, territorial, and solitary. It hunts rodents and birds with patience and precision, and it is especially well adapted to dry environments where water is scarce. Its range overlapped almost perfectly with the first regions of human agriculture, stretching from the Nile Valley across the Levant and Mesopotamia. It is here that people first built permanent villages, stored grain, and attracted the rodent populations that in turn attracted cats. Other wildcats, such as those in Europe or Central Asia, lived far from these centres of early agriculture. Their chance to interact closely with humans came much later, and by then the Near Eastern lineage had already established itself as the commensal partner of our species. This geographic overlap is important. Domestication is not just about which species can be tamed, but which ones are in the right place at the right time. Goats and sheep lived in the hills near Neolithic villages, and so they became the first herded livestock. Wolves lingered near camps, scavenging food, and thus became the ancestors of dogs. The Near Eastern wildcat prowled the edges of grain stores, hunting mice, and thus became the ancestor of domestic cats. It was less a matter of choice than of circumstance. The Fertile Crescent was a stage and Libica was in the spotlight. Still, the question remains, why only this subspecies? Why did the European wildcat not also become domesticated later, when agriculture spread north? The answer lies in temperament. European wildcats are notoriously aggressive and less tolerant of human presence. Even today, attempts to tame them are met with ferocity. The Near Eastern wildcat, by contrast, appears to have had a slightly more flexible temperament, with individuals able to tolerate closer proximity to humans. This was not universal. Most wildcats remained wary and solitary, but enough of them were bold enough to linger near villages, and over generations this created a population more habituated to human environments. That subtle behavioural difference, invisible in bones but visible in outcome, may be the key to why Libica and not others gave rise to our housecats. The genetic evidence also raises questions about continuity. If every modern cat descends from Near Eastern wildcats, then what happened to the other wild populations? Many still exist, but interbreeding with domestic cats is an ongoing issue. In places like Scotland and Hungary, conservationists worry that the European wildcat is losing its genetic identity as it mates with feral domestic cats. In a sense, the success of Libica's descendants threatens the survival of its cousins. This is an unintended consequence of domestication. The dominance of one lineage often comes at the expense of others. It is important to remember that the cats of 10,000 years ago were not yet domestic in the way we think of today. They were still wild in form and largely wild in behaviour. What makes them significant is that they carried the genes that would, through millennia of gradual selection, become the genetic foundation of all housecats. These are the ghost genes of the ancestor, invisible to the farmers who watched cats slip into their granaries but obvious to us now through the lens of DNA analysis. The bones found in Neolithic sites look like wildcats. The artwork of later millennia shows animals that look much like modern wildcats, yet hidden inside their cells was a genetic lineage that would one day spread to every corner of the world. The humility of this knowledge lies in how recent it is. Until the 21st century, scholars debated whether cats had multiple origins of domestication, whether Egyptian cats represented a separate domestication event from Near Eastern ones, and whether European wildcats had contributed to the gene pool. It is only through modern genetic surveys, sampling both ancient remains and living populations, that we can now say with confidence that Felis sylvestris libica is the root. Even so, mysteries remain. Did domestication occur once, in a single region, or multiple times within the Near East? Were cats repeatedly drawn into human settlements in different places, only for their lineages to merge later? These are questions still being debated. The evidence points to the Fertile Crescent as the heart, but the edges of the story are still blurred. This leads us to a haunting question. If one wild cat lineage could so easily become entwined with us, how many others might have, under different circumstances? If agriculture had begun in Europe rather than the Near East, would we now share our homes with descendants of the European wildcat, fiercer and less forgiving? If Central Asian communities had created the first great grain stores, would Felis sylvestris ornata have filled the role instead? History is contingent. The housecat is not inevitable. It is the product of place, time, and a particular wildcat with the right traits at the right moment. Today, when you look at a domestic cat stretching on a windowsill or curling into a warm lap, you are looking at the living echo of Libica, the stripes on its legs, the hunting crouch it assumes when a toy skitters across the floor, the independence with which it wanders the night, all are ghost traces of that ancestor in the Fertile Crescent. The genes remain, even if the wild independence has been softened. The story of cats with us began not because we designed it, but because Libica's descendants found a way to live in the world we had accidentally created. That lineage spread, while others did not. In the end, every housecat is a reminder of the chance meeting of human and wildcat in the early Holocene, a meeting written into their DNA. Did humans actually invite cats in? The idea sounds almost comical when we picture how aloof and independent cats are today, yet in the Neolithic landscapes of 8,000 to 6,000 years before the present, something very much like an invitation was extended. It was not a verbal call or a conscious plan. It was ecological. By planting fields, storing crops, and creating permanent villages, humans built an environment that quietly opened its doors to predators like the Near Eastern wildcat. In these early farming communities, people and cats began to form a relationship that neither side had deliberately designed, but which benefited both. The Neolithic was the great experiment in farming, a time when hunter-gatherers shifted towards sedentary life and began to rely on cultivated grains. Across the Fertile Crescent and beyond, wheat and barley were staples, later joined by millet as it spread from North China into West Asia. Storing these crops was essential. Without secure granaries, entire villages would starve during lean months, but storage was never entirely secure. Rodents found their way into every basket, bin, or clay jar, gnawing through reeds and burrowing under foundations. Archaeological sites from this period are littered with rodent remains, burrow traces and gnawed seed husks, clear evidence of the scale of the problem. For a farmer, a single mouse could mean little, but thousands of them nesting in storage pits meant devastation. Imagine tending fields for months, threshing grain, drying it carefully, sealing it against the damp, only to hear the tiny scrabble of claws at night and find holes gnawed through your stores. The Neolithic villagers developed ceramic jars with overhanging rims designed to make it harder for rodents to climb inside, but these were only partial solutions. Against swarming populations of house mice, the best defense was a predator that would stalk them tirelessly. And here, evolution and ecology handed humans a partner, the Near Eastern wildcat. These small cats had hunted rodents long before villages existed, but with the rise of farming, they suddenly encountered dense concentrations of prey. For a wildcat, a Neolithic granary was like a modern buffet, refilled each season. It is not hard to imagine the first encounters. A wildcat slipping into a settlement under cover of darkness, catching mice among the grain baskets, and retreating before dawn. People must have noticed. Cats are not silent when they kill. The squeal of prey and the thud of a leap would have echoed in the quiet night. The morning after, fewer gnawed husks would have been found. The connection was simple and immediate. Where the cats prowled, there was less damage. This is where the notion of invitation comes in. People did not capture wildcats and train them, but they tolerated their presence. They may have left scraps of food, or allowed kittens to linger near hearths. Unlike wolves, which were large enough to threaten livestock and people, cats were small and presented little danger. Their benefit, in contrast, was enormous. Over generations, this tolerance was itself a kind of selection pressure. The cats that could stand to live near people enjoyed a steady supply of prey and protection from larger predators. The people in turn reaped the reward of safer grain stores. Neither side planned it, but both sides gained. We can see glimpses of this process in the archaeological record, not through domesticated bones, but through the ecology written in isotopes. At the site of Quanhukun in northern China, though later than the period we are considering here, isotope analysis of cat bones revealed diets rich in millet-fed rodents, and even some direct consumption of millet. This shows that cats living near villages were drawn into human food webs. Although that particular evidence comes from about 5,300 years ago, it illustrates a principle likely already in place thousands of years earlier in the Fertile Crescent. Cats were eating rodents fattened on stored crops, and in some cases they may have scavenged directly from human refuse. This makes their role unique among domesticated animals. Goats and sheep were corralled, bred, and eaten. Dogs were trained and selected to hunt, guard, and herd. Cats were neither herded nor directed. They were mutualists, joining human communities because it suited their hunting strategy, and humans tolerated them because it suited their survival. That subtle dynamic is why cats today remain so independent. They were never shaped as thoroughly by selective breeding as dogs or livestock. Their role was not to serve humans directly, but to serve themselves in ways that happened to align with human needs. What makes this story compelling is how invisible it is in the material record. When we look at the bones of cats from this period, they are indistinguishable from their wild cousins. The changes were behavioural, ecological, and genetic in ways that we can now only glimpse through modern DNA analysis. Ancient farmers did not leave us notes about cats prowling their barns. Yet we can infer their presence because villages continued to grow, food storage became more reliable, and alongside these patterns we find early traces of cats integrated into human life. The ghost of their presence lies in the reduction of rodent damage and the survival of settlements that might otherwise have been overrun. This period also set the stage for the spread of cats beyond their original range. Once farming villages became stable and began to trade with one another, people carried more than grain and pottery along their routes. They carried the entire ecological community that had grown up around farming: rodents, dogs, and, inevitably, cats. As granaries expanded and agriculture spread, so too did the cats that hunted the pests. By tolerating them, people ensured that their reach would widen. A commensal species had become a travelling partner. The humility in this story is that humans were not in control. We often imagine domestication as a one-sided act, humans bending animals to their will. But here, the evidence suggests something else. We created conditions that favoured a predator, and the predator joined us of its own accord. It was not that we invited cats into our homes with open arms. Rather, we built a world that beckoned them, and then we let them stay. And so the haunting question is this: how much of what we call domestication is really agency on our part, and how much is animals making choices that we merely accepted? Did we domesticate cats, or did they domesticate us by making themselves indispensable guardians of our food? The truth is probably somewhere in between. In those villages of 8,000 to 6,000 years before the present, cats were not pets, not yet. They were hunters at the threshold, slipping between wild and domestic worlds, tolerated because they solved a problem we could not. Their pawprints are faint in the dust of history, but they led us into a partnership that endures to this day. What does a cat's diet tell us about its relationship with humans? To most of us, food scraps are invisible details, the leftovers of a meal, the crumbs brushed from a table. But in archaeology, the chemistry of what was eaten can reveal entire hidden relationships. At the village of Quanhukun, in what is now Shanxi Province, China, about 5,600 years ago, bones of cats preserved in refuse pits were put under a kind of chemical interrogation. Scientists measured the isotopes of carbon and nitrogen preserved in their collagen, and what emerged was one of the earliest clear signs of mutualism between cats and humans. The cats had been eating millet, directly or indirectly, and that fact alone carries enormous implications for the history of domestication. The villagers of Quanhukun were part of the Yangshao culture, one of the great Neolithic traditions of northern China. Their economy rested heavily on millet agriculture. Foxtail millet and broomcorn millet, both C4 plants in botanical terms, dominated their fields. These grains grew well in the dry loess soils of the region, forming the basis of both human and animal diets. Stored in pits and vessels, millet drew rodents in droves, just as wheat and barley had done thousands of years earlier in the Fertile Crescent. And just as in that earlier story, cats arrived to take advantage. What makes Quanhukun unique is that the chemical record of this interaction is preserved with surprising clarity. Isotopes are subtle signatures, ratios of different forms of atoms that vary depending on what plants and animals are consumed. C3 plants such as trees and many grasses leave different carbon isotope values than C4 plants like millet. Nitrogen isotopes, meanwhile, reflect the position of an organism in the food chain. By sampling bone collagen, researchers can reconstruct what an animal ate across its lifetime. At Quanhukun, the humans show strong signatures of millet consumption, as do their pigs and dogs. This makes sense, since pigs were fed kitchen scraps and dogs scavenged or were directly provisioned. But the striking result comes from the cats. Their bones also bear the carbon signal of millet. Not as strongly as the pigs or humans, but unmistakably there. How does a carnivore and obligate hunter end up with millet in its chemical fingerprint? The answer lies in the food web. Rodents feasted on stored millet. Cats feasted on the rodents. And in at least one case, a particular cat seems to have eaten more millet than expected, suggesting it either scavenged directly from human stores or was fed by people. This cat had a lower nitrogen isotope value, indicating less animal protein in its diet. Perhaps it was old or injured and relied more heavily on human scraps. Perhaps it was tolerated near households and given grain gruel or leftovers. Whatever the case, this cat was not living in the wild. It was part of the human niche. The implications are profound. Here is measurable evidence that cats had entered into human food systems, not just as opportunistic predators, but as participants. Their prey was tied to agriculture. Their survival was linked to what people planted, stored, and ate. The isotopic evidence confirms what had long been hypothesized, that cats were drawn into human communities because agriculture created stable food webs that favored them. But it goes further by suggesting that people may have begun to reciprocate, providing food in return for the services cats rendered. That is the essence of mutualism. It is worth pausing to appreciate the nuance here. These cats were not yet domesticated in any strict sense. Their bones are within the size range of wildcats. They do not show clear morphological changes, but their diets tell us that they were living differently than truly wild animals. One cat in particular had lived long enough to show worn teeth and healed injuries, suggesting it survived with human support. In the wild, a cat with reduced hunting ability would likely starve. At Quanakun, it survived, possibly because it had access to human-provided food. That survival is a tiny but important signal of a new relationship forming. The context of the site reinforces this interpretation. Quanakun was not a temporary camp, but a permanent agricultural village. It had houses, storage pits, pottery, and evidence of long-term occupation. Rodents were a serious threat. Archaeologists found burrows leading into grain storage areas and ceramic containers designed to block rodent entry. The problem was chronic, and the presence of cats was a solution. This was not a chance encounter, but a stable ecological arrangement. Humans created food abundance. Rodents exploited it. Cats exploited rodents. And people, in turn, benefited from the cat's presence. From the perspective of the cats, this was a winning strategy. Instead of roaming wide territories in search of prey, they could linger near villages and hunt rodents that were themselves supported by millet. It was an energy-rich niche, reliable year after year. From the perspective of the villagers, cats were allies against an enemy they could never fully eliminate. The relationship was pragmatic, not sentimental. But pragmatism can form the basis of lasting bonds. We should also acknowledge the uncertainties. The isotopic signatures tell us what was eaten, but not the exact social dynamics. Did villagers intentionally encourage cats, perhaps leaving food for them? Or did they merely tolerate their presence, with mutualism emerging without explicit intention? Were cats beginning to breed within villages, creating populations more habituated to humans? Or were they continually drawn in from surrounding wild populations? These are questions still debated. The bones cannot tell us everything, yet they do tell us that cats were eating differently than wild ones would, and that is enough to mark a turning point. This evidence from China also broadens the geographic story. For a long time, scholars focused on the Near East as the sole cradle of cat domestication, but Quanakun shows that far to the east, cats were also entering into commensal relationships with humans. Whether these cats were direct descendants of Near Eastern wildcats transported eastward, or local wildcats entering similar relationships remains unclear. Ancient DNA may eventually resolve this. For now, the isotopes give us proof that wherever agriculture spread, cats were ready to follow, slotting themselves into the ecological niches humans had unknowingly built for them. There is a haunting thought in all this. When we picture the Neolithic, we often imagine people inventing domestication as a kind of deliberate act. But here we see how the chemistry of food webs reveals another truth. Domestication was not always invention. It was participation in ecological systems that humans themselves had set in motion. Cats did not need to be invited. They were already there, shaped by the availability of rodents fattened on millet. In that sense, domestication was less a human achievement than a shared adaptation, a convergence of needs. The story of Quanakun reminds us to look for the invisible traces of history. The shape of a bone can tell us age, size, or injury. but the isotopes whisper what was eaten, what paths energy took from field to rodent to cat. In those chemical pathways lies a story of one of the earliest mutualisms between humans and cats. It was not yet the cosy companionship we imagine today. It was survival, pragmatic and mutual, yet it was the seed of a bond that would carry forward for millennia. So when we ask what a cat's diet can tell us about its relationship with humans, the answer is simple and profound. It tells us that by 5,600 years ago, cats were no longer just wild predators. They were members of human food webs, hunters at the edges of villages, sometimes scavengers, sometimes fed, and sometimes surviving with human help. They were becoming our partners, not through force or breeding, but through the quiet chemistry of shared survival. Why did one Neolithic cat eat like a human? At Quanokun, the same agricultural village in northern China where isotopic chemistry opened a window into the hidden diet of ancient animals, one cat stood out. Most cats at the site bore the chemical imprint of a hunter's life. They fed on rodents who themselves fattened on the millet crops of the villagers, carrying faint traces of millet in their own bones as a secondary echo. But one animal departed from that pattern. Its isotopic profile revealed unusually high levels of millet consumption, not just the ghost of grain passing through rodents, but direct intake of millet itself. For an obligate carnivore, this was an anomaly, and in that anomaly lies one of the earliest suggestions that cats had crossed a subtle threshold in their relationship with humans. The evidence comes from stable isotope analysis, the same method that revealed millet in the diets of pigs, dogs and humans at Quanokun. Most carnivores have high nitrogen isotope ratios, reflecting a diet rich in animal protein. Herbivores, by contrast, sit low in that hierarchy. This particular cat, however, had a lower nitrogen signature than its peers, indicating less reliance on meat. Its carbon values, meanwhile, suggested a strong intake of C4 plants like millet. The combination pointed to something remarkable. This cat was not subsisting solely on the prey it caught. It was eating plant-derived foods, either scavenged or provided, in a way more typical of pigs or even humans. Why would a cat do this? Several possibilities arise, none of them mutually exclusive. One is that the cat was old or injured, with worn teeth that made hunting difficult. Indeed, one mandible found at the site shows heavy wear consistent with age. An animal past its prime would have been less effective at catching nimble rodents. To survive, it may have scavenged directly from food refuse or consumed cooked grains discarded by humans. Another possibility is that the villagers themselves fed it, intentionally or not. Scraps from meals, millet porridge, or other leftovers may have been accessible, and a bold cat could have adapted to eating them. This would not have been normal feline behaviour, but survival often bends the rules of ecology. If villagers tolerated or even encouraged this feeding, it represents something important. It suggests that by the middle of the 6th millennium before the present, humans were not merely coexisting with cats as incidental hunters, but may have been extending care, however minimal. Feeding an injured or elderly cat does not mean it was a pet in the modern sense, but it does hint at recognition of value beyond pure utility. Perhaps the villagers saw the animal as worth keeping alive, even if its hunting days were past. Perhaps the mere presence of cats deterred rodents, making it beneficial to maintain them. These are speculations, but they align with the chemical evidence of a cat living differently from its wild peers. This moment matters because it illustrates the range of relationships possible in early domestication. Not every cat at Quanokun was integrated into human life. Most remained hunters on the margins, tied to human food webs only indirectly. But this one animal blurred the line. It strayed closer, ate more like a human, and in doing so, it gives us the first tangible sign of an animal crossing from opportunistic ally to tolerated dependent. It is easy to overlook how strange this is. Cats are obligate carnivores, their bodies built to process protein and fat. Their teeth are designed for tearing flesh, not grinding grain. Their digestive systems are short and specialized. Yet here we see chemical evidence of one surviving partly on millet, a plant food foreign to its evolutionary design. It reminds us that domestication is not just a matter of anatomy or genetics, but of ecological flexibility. Even an obligate carnivore can adapt under the pressures of living with humans. The broader context of Quanokun reinforces this interpretation. The site shows heavy rodent pressure on grain stores. Ceramic vessels were shaped to resist gnawing. Storage pits bore rodent burrows. People were in a constant struggle to protect their food. Cats were useful as hunters, but usefulness alone does not explain why one was surviving on human food. Something more must have been happening. Whether intentional feeding or tolerated scavenging, this suggests that villagers saw cats not just as background wildlife, but as part of their community. We must be cautious, however. One cat does not prove domestication. The morphological data show no clear difference from wildcats. Ancient DNA from Quanokun is not yet available to tell us whether these cats were Near Eastern imports or local wild lineages. The evidence is a single chemical outlier, interpreted against a backdrop of ecology and context. Yet in archaeology, anomalies matter. They point to possibilities. They remind us that domestication was not a clean line, but a spectrum of relationships ranging from wild to tame, opportunistic to cared for. This cat, with its millet-heavy diet, lies somewhere along that spectrum. The haunting question is whether this represents an early step toward the fully domesticated cat, or a local experiment that faded. Did people in Neolithic China begin a parallel path of cat domestication, only for it to be replaced later by Near Eastern domestic lineages that spread eastward? Or did local wildcats simply adapt temporarily to village life without leaving descendants? The isotopic signatures cannot answer that, but they tell us that wherever agriculture arose, the ecological niche for cats was present, and cats filled it. This story also challenges our assumptions about control. We often think of domestication as a human-directed process, deliberate and goal-oriented, but here the evidence suggests something less structured. A cat found a way to live off millet, and people allowed it. The relationship emerged not through planning, but through tolerance. And tolerance, over generations, can reshape species. From a modern perspective, we might see the Quanokun cat as the first hint of companionship. A creature fed by humans, living in their settlement, surviving longer than it might have in the wild. But we must resist projecting too much sentiment backward. The villagers may not have thought of it as a friend or pet. They may simply have recognised that a cat in the village was better than none at all, even if it no longer hunted effectively. Pragmatism, not affection, may have underpinned the relationship, yet out of such pragmatism, companionship can eventually grow. So why did one Neolithic cat eat like a human? Because domestication is messy. Because animals adapt to niches humans create. Because survival sometimes requires breaking biological rules. In the worn teeth of a millet-fed cat, we glimpse not only the hardship of life in a Neolithic village, but the first faint outline of a future in which cats would live not only alongside us, but with us. What role did wildcats play in the earlier cities? To answer this, we can look to Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the world. Between 7,000 and 5,000 years before the present, Jericho was already something remarkable. Not just a farming village, but a proto-city. Its walls, towers, and dense clusters of mud brick houses spoke to a scale of human organisation unprecedented in earlier Neolithic sites. With this density of people came new problems: disease, sanitation, and above all, pests. Where there were granaries stacked with barley and emmer wheat, there were rodents. And where there were rodents, there were cats. The story of Jericho is often told in terms of architecture and agriculture, but its ecological dimension is equally important. By this time, farming had been practiced in the Levant for millennia. Grain storage was no longer an experimental strategy, but the lifeblood of urban life. Rodents exploited this abundance on a scale that smaller farming hamlets had never seen. Thousands of people meant thousands of baskets, jars, and storage pits. Every wall and floor provided hiding places for mice. The problem was not seasonal but constant, a year-round pressure on human survival. And it is here that the silent stalker, the Near Eastern wildcat, likely played an increasingly important role. Archaeological finds at Jericho include cat remains among the faunal assemblages, though they are sparse and fragmentary. A mandible here, a humerus there, often mixed with bones of dogs, pigs, and other animals that lived in or around the settlement. On their own, these fragments do not look extraordinary. but their presence in a proto-urban context suggests that cats were not rare visitors. They were part of the living ecosystem of Jericho, drawn by the dense rodent populations that flourished among the granaries and refuse piles. The people of Jericho had limited tools to defend their food. They constructed storage facilities with raised floors and plastered walls to deter burrowers. They sealed jars with clay. Yet none of these methods was foolproof. Rodents gnawed, burrowed, and bred faster than people could stop them. For humans, the cost was hunger. For cats, it was opportunity. Unlike dogs, which required feeding and management, cats asked for nothing. They came and went as they pleased, slipping silently through alleys and granaries, reducing rodent numbers by predation alone. The urban context magnified their value. In a small hamlet, a single cat might make a difference in 1 or 2 storage pits. In a proto-city, a population of cats could have a measurable impact on public health and food security. Fewer rodents meant fewer droppings contaminating grain and fewer parasites spreading to people. Although there is no direct textual evidence from this period, the indirect evidence points to a growing recognition that cats were beneficial neighbours. They were tolerated in ways other predators were not. The ecological role of cats in Jericho raises questions about the beginnings of human tolerance and even protection of these animals. Did people begin to view them as part of the urban environment, almost like an infrastructure of pest control? The bones do not tell us if cats were fed, but their presence in the archaeological record of an early city suggests that they were more than random wanderers. Urban density created niches that wildcats could reliably exploit, and in doing so they became, however invisibly, contributors to the survival of the city. This period also marks a shift in scale. In earlier farming villages, the relationship between humans and cats was local and limited. At Jericho, the relationship became systemic. The same dynamics that created proto-urban life, surplus grain, permanent architecture, large populations, also created the perfect environment for cats to entrench themselves. Their value was not sentimental, but structural, woven into the way cities functioned. We should be careful not to romanticize this. Cats at Jericho were not yet domestic animals in the sense we recognize today. Their bones remain indistinguishable from wild Near Eastern wildcats. They likely remained solitary, skittish, and aggressive when approached. They were hunters, not companions. Yet their consistent presence in proto-urban settlements tells us something important. They had begun to align their survival with ours, not just in isolated villages, but at the heart of the earliest cities. The haunting question is whether this was the beginning of domestication, or simply an extension of opportunism. Were the cats of Jericho on their way to becoming housecats? Or were they wild predators exploiting human-created niches while remaining genetically and behaviourally wild? The evidence cannot answer definitively, but the pattern is clear. Wherever humans built grain stores, cats followed. And at Jericho, one of the earliest cities, the silent stalker walked alongside the first urban dwellers, uninvited but indispensable. How did a mouse hunter become a goddess? Nowhere in history is this question more vivid than in ancient Egypt between 2000 and 1000 years before the Common Era, when the cat ceased to be only a silent stalker in granaries and fields, and was elevated into divine form. It was in Egypt that the feline became more than useful, more than tolerated. It became sacred, intertwined with gods and households, embodying both tenderness and terror. Egyptian religion was never a simple catalogue of deities. It was a web of shifting associations, local cults, and layered symbols. Into this system, cats found entry because they embodied qualities the Egyptians already revered: stealth, independence, fertility, ferocity in defense of their young, and uncanny ability to kill the snakes, scorpions, and rodents that threatened both people and food supplies. What began as practical admiration gradually crystallized into worship, and the story of Bastet and Sekhmet shows how that transformation took place. Sekhmet was the older face of the feline divine, a lioness-headed goddess associated with war, plague, and the blazing heat of the sun. She was fierce, destructive, and difficult to appease. In myths, she was said to unleash chaos when humanity displeased the gods, drinking rivers of blood in her fury. To worship Sekhmet was to acknowledge the uncontrollable forces of the desert sun, the wrath of disease, and the violence of war. She was dangerous and necessary, a reminder that divinity was not always benevolent. Bastet, by contrast, evolved as the softer domestic counterpart. Originally also depicted as a lioness, over time her image shifted to that of a domestic cat. This change occurred during the second millennium before the Common Era, perhaps reflecting how cats had by then become common features of Egyptian households. Bastet represented fertility, motherhood, and protection of the home, where Sekhmet was a lioness at the horizon, Bastet was the cat at the hearth. Together they represented a duality that Egyptians valued: the feral and the tame, destruction and nurture, danger and comfort. The cult of Bastet flourished especially in the city of Bubastis in the Nile Delta, which became a centre of pilgrimage. Here, temples were built not only to honour the goddess but also to channel her protective qualities into the daily lives of the people. Bastet was invoked in childbirth, in the health of children, and in the safety of the household. She was depicted holding a sistrum, a rattle-like instrument used in ritual, and often shown with litters of kittens, reinforcing her association with fertility and family. In a society where high infant mortality and threats from disease were constant, the promise of Bastet's guardianship carried deep appeal. The rise of Bastet tells us much about how Egyptians perceived their relationship with animals. Unlike dogs, which had long been associated with hunting and the afterlife, cats occupied a dual role as both useful hunters and mysterious protectors. They were independent enough to seem otherworldly, yet present enough in daily life to be seen as guardians of the home. When Egyptians painted or sculpted cats in divine form, they were not anthropomorphizing a pet, but acknowledging the sacred qualities they saw in the animal's behavior. The vigilance of a cat in watching over a house became a symbol of divine vigilance. It is striking that cats were not simply feared or admired as wild animals, but were integrated into family life to a degree that shaped religious imagery. In Egyptian art, cats appear beneath chairs in domestic scenes, calmly seated as part of the household. This integration was a visual echo of their real role as protectors of stored grain and defenders against vermin. But in elevating them to divine status, Egyptians projected that practical role into the realm of cosmic order. Just as the household needed protection, so too did the cosmic household of gods and humans. The cat, therefore, became a fitting symbol of balance between chaos and harmony. One myth illustrates this tension. Sekhmet, enraged with humanity, was tricked by the gods into drinking beer dyed red to resemble blood. Drunk, she fell asleep, her wrath quenched. In some retellings, it is Bastet who emerges from this softened state, a transformation from lioness to housecat, from fury to gentleness. The story embodies how Egyptians reconciled the destructive with the nurturing. The feline could be both, depending on context, and both aspects were necessary for balance. Why cats rather than other animals? The answer lies partly in ecology. Cats were unique in the way they integrated into human settlements without losing their predatory independence. They were not fully domesticated in the sense of being controlled or bred for tasks. Their ability to thrive without direct human management gave them an aura of autonomy. Egyptians, who valued both order and mystery, may have seen in this independence a reflection of divine power, close enough to benefit humans, distant enough to remain beyond their control. This symbolic elevation also had political dimensions. Pharaohs were often linked with lions, symbols of strength and kingship. By embracing cats in religious art, the rulers associated themselves with both the fierce protection of Sekhmet and the nurturing fertility of Bastet. To claim feline symbolism was to claim the ability to protect Egypt from enemies and ensure abundance for its people. Thus, cats were not only religious icons but also political emblems of stability and divine order. The haunting question is how much this elevation changed the way Egyptians interacted with real cats. Did they treat household cats differently because of their divine associations? The archaeological record suggests yes, though not always in ways we might expect. Household cats appear in paintings and statuettes as companions. Names of cats have been preserved in inscriptions, suggesting some were recognized as individuals. Yet the divine elevation of cats also led to practices that commodified them, a story that belongs to later developments in Egyptian religion. In this earlier period, however, the emphasis was on their symbolic duality and their role as protectors. By the end of the second millennium before the Common Era, the cat had become firmly entrenched in Egyptian iconography and ritual. It had travelled far from its origins as a grain hunter in Neolithic villages. In Egypt it became a goddess, embodying the paradox of independence and intimacy, terror and comfort. The practical reality of cats as hunters against vermin had been reimagined as cosmic protection, woven into myths that explain the balance of the world. How did a mouse hunter become a goddess? By embodying qualities Egyptians recognised as divine: the power to protect, the independence that demanded respect, and the ability to shift between fury and nurture. In their duality, cats mirrored the duality Egyptians saw in life itself. To revere Bastet was not just to worship an animal, but to acknowledge that even the smallest hunter could embody the balance of the cosmos. Why were kittens bred only to be killed? Few practices in ancient Egypt raise more unsettling questions than the mass production of cat mummies. Between 1,000 and 200 years before the Common Era, during the late period and into the Ptolemaic era, the reverence for feline divinity turned into something that to modern eyes looks less like devotion and more like industry. Cats had long been symbols of protection and fertility, with Bastet and Sekhmet embodying their divine roles. But as temple economies grew and demand for votive offerings exploded, cats were drawn into a system that raised, culled and mummified them by the tens of thousands. The evidence is stark. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Saqqara, Bubastis and Abydos have revealed cat cemeteries with astonishing numbers of mummies. One 19th century excavation at Beni Hassan reportedly unearthed hundreds of thousands of cat remains, many exported to Britain as fertilizer. While not every report from that period is reliable, modern studies confirm the scale was immense. The sheer volume of cat mummies points to deliberate breeding and ritual killing, not merely the burial of beloved pets. Ancient economic texts help explain this phenomenon. Temples were not just religious centres, but also political and economic hubs. They owned land, employed priests and produced goods. Worshippers brought offerings to the gods, and these offerings could take many forms: food, figurines, amulets, and in the case of feline deities, mummified cats. The logic was transactional. You gave a gift to the god, and in return you hoped for protection, health, fertility, or favour in the afterlife. A cat mummy was an offering par excellence, embodying the sacred animal itself. This created demand, and demand required supply. Textual and archaeological sources suggest that temples maintained enclosures, catteries, where cats were bred and raised for ritual use. Travellers in antiquity, including Greek visitors like Herodotus, noted the ubiquity of cats in Egyptian religion. Though they did not always describe the mechanics, the remains tell the rest of the story. Many mummies contain kittens only a few months old, their necks broken or skulls crushed to ensure quick death before embalming. Others contain only partial remains or bundles of reeds shaped like cats, suggesting that when supply failed, substitutes were created. To modern sensibilities, this practice seems cruel. But to understand it in context, we must place it within Egyptian ideas of reciprocity with the gods. The cat was not only a creature, but also a vessel of divine essence. By offering a mummified cat, a worshipper was giving Bastet or Sekhmet a piece of their own power back, a cycle of gift and gratitude. The sacrifice of kittens was not hidden or shameful. It was part of maintaining cosmic balance. Death was not an end, but a transition. And in that worldview, the killing of animals for sacred purposes was a renewal, not a waste. There was also a practical dimension. Egypt was not unique in breeding animals for ritual sacrifice. Cattle, birds, and fish were raised for offerings across the ancient world. What makes the cat case striking is its scale and its connection to a single animal so closely tied to daily life. Unlike cattle, cats were not eaten. Their role was purely symbolic. The fact that temples sustained entire breeding operations for them underscores just how central they had become in Egyptian ritual practice by the first millennium before the Common Era. The embalming of these cats followed procedures similar to human mummification, though often less elaborate. Bodies were eviscerated or sometimes left intact, treated with resin, wrapped in linen, and decorated with painted masks or intricate wrappings that emphasized feline features. Some were placed in bronze or wooden coffins shaped like cats. Archaeologists studying these remains have found great variation in quality. from carefully preserved animals to hastily prepared bundles. This range reflects differences in cost and accessibility. Wealthier devotees could afford finely embalmed cats, while the poor purchased simpler versions. Religion and economy intersected in layers of social stratification, even in offerings to the gods. Scientific studies of the mummies have revealed further details. Radiographic analyses show consistent patterns of lethal injuries in kittens, confirming deliberate sacrifice. Chemical tests reveal resins imported from distant lands, showing the investment in materials. DNA studies suggest that while most of these cats were closely related to the Near Eastern wildcat lineage, they also carried signatures of domestication, reinforcing that they were bred within settlements rather than trapped in the wild. The mummies are thus both zoological evidence and economic artifacts, recording how a society integrated an animal into its spiritual economy. The haunting part of this story is the paradox. Egyptians revered cats to the point of elevating them into divine form, yet that reverence led to their mass sacrifice. To the Egyptians, this was not contradiction, but devotion. To us it feels alien. Were these cats beloved in life before they were killed? Did priests or caretakers grow attached to them, or were they seen only as vessels for ritual? The archaeological record is silent on emotions. It leaves us only with the bones, the wrappings, and the knowledge that millions of animals passed through this system over centuries. By the later centuries of the first millennium before the Common Era, the industry of cat mummification had reached its peak. Pilgrims came to temples across Egypt seeking protection or healing, and cat mummies were available for purchase much like candles in a modern church. Some were placed in catacombs beneath temples, vast galleries filled with rows upon rows of feline bundles. Others were buried in smaller caches. In both cases the message was the same. By offering the cat, the devotee affirmed their piety and sought the favour of the gods. This industrialization of devotion raises broader questions about how religion functions in complex societies. Was the cat mummy industry a form of exploitation, or was it simply the logical extension of a worldview that saw animals as divine intermediaries? Did the practice diminish the reverence for cats, or reinforce it by making them ever present in the rituals of daily life? The evidence suggests that far from devaluing cats, the mass production of their mummies amplified their sacred role. They were everywhere, in homes, in art, and in temples. They were both living companions and holy offerings. So why were kittens bred only to be killed? Because in the intricate logic of Egyptian religion, the cycle of life and death was not cruelty but continuity. The cat, hunter of vermin and protector of households, was also a vessel of divine power. To give that vessel back to the gods was to sustain the balance of the world. We may never know how individual Egyptians felt about the animals they bred and sacrificed, but the material record shows us a civilization that wove cats into its spiritual and economic life more deeply than any before or since. What made a cat festival draw hundreds of thousands? If we believe the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who travelled in Egypt during the 5th century before the Common Era, the answer was Bubastis. This city on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta became one of the most famous cult centres in all of Egypt, not because it was the political capital or home to towering pyramids, but because it was the sacred seat of Bastet, the goddess with the head of a cat. Herodotus wrote that each year men and women journeyed to Bubastis in boats laden with pilgrims, music and wine. According to his account, as many as 700,000 people could descend on the city during the annual festival. They arrived not with solemn piety, but with revelry, in what later writers called the Festival of Drunkenness. Bubastis was already significant by the time it became central to Bastet's worship. The city, known to Egyptians as Per Bastet, meaning the House of Bastet, was a bustling settlement with a temple complex that rivaled other great religious centres of Egypt. Archaeological remains suggest the temple was expanded during the 22nd dynasty, beginning around 945 years before the Common Era, a dynasty whose rulers favoured Bastet's cult. The temple complex itself was surrounded by canals and gardens, creating an impression of lush abundance. Herodotus described it as one of the most beautiful sanctuaries in Egypt, not for the sheer size of its monuments, but for its harmonious setting, which set it apart from the more austere stone complexes elsewhere. The festivals that took place here were not minor local events. Pilgrims travelled from across Egypt, and their journeys were as much a part of the ritual as their arrival. Herodotus paints a lively picture of boats filled with music, flutes, and dancing, of women shouting jokes at villagers along the riverbanks, and of wine flowing freely as participants made their way to Bubastis. This atmosphere may strike us as incongruous with worship, but in Egyptian religion joy and abundance were essential offerings. The laughter, the music, and yes, the drunkenness were ways to honour Bastet, whose protective and fertile qualities were celebrated in the language of excess and release. The connection between cats and celebration may seem strange at first. After all, cats are quiet, stealthy animals, hardly associated with wild revelry. But Bastet was more than a cat. She was a complex deity who embodied fertility, music, sexuality, and domestic protection. Her gentle side balanced the fierce nature of Sekhmet, and her cult centred on the joy of life rather than fear of destruction. The festival of Bubastis was thus not only a religious occasion, but also a social one, an outlet where Egyptians could participate in collective joy sanctioned by divine association. The scale of the gathering indicates the centrality of Bastet's cult in Egyptian life during the first millennium before the Common Era. If Herodotus's numbers are exaggerated, and they almost certainly are since 700,000 people would have been a significant fraction of Egypt's entire population, the point remains that these festivals drew immense crowds. They were among the largest religious pilgrimages of the ancient world. Archaeological evidence from Bubastis, including remains of temples, votive objects and inscriptions, confirms that the city was a major centre of devotion, attracting pilgrims and donations that enriched the temple's economy. These festivals reveal another aspect of Egyptian religion that is sometimes overlooked, its performative and communal nature. While many religious practices involved solemn offerings, rituals and prayers, others revolved around collective celebration. At Bubastis, the music of the sistrum rattles, the dancing and the intoxication were themselves acts of worship. In a society where daily life could be harsh, filled with labour, disease and the uncertainties of Nile flooding, sanctioned moments of release allowed people to express gratitude for fertility and abundance. Bastet, the goddess who protected households and children, was honoured not by austerity but by joy. There is also a political dimension. The rulers who expanded the temple at Bubastis and supported Bastet's cult were consolidating power in the Delta region. By associating themselves with Bastet, they tied their authority to a deity beloved by common people, and by pilgrims across Egypt. The festival thus reinforced not only religious devotion, but also political legitimacy. It demonstrated the wealth and generosity of the temple, the fertility of the land, and the prosperity of the rulers who maintained this divine order. The festival of drunkenness itself may have had mythological roots. In the myth of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess was tricked into drinking beer dyed red to resemble blood. Intoxicated, she abandoned her rage, saving humanity from destruction. The annual festival may have echoed this myth, reenacting the theme of transformation from wrath to joy, from destruction to fertility. In drinking to excess, participants symbolically reenacted the taming of chaos. In celebrating Bastet, they affirmed that joy and laughter could restore balance to the cosmos. What did it mean for ordinary Egyptians to attend? For many, the festival was a rare chance to travel, to meet people from distant villages, and to participate in collective ritual. The journey by boat, the music and dancing, and the arrival at Bubastis created a shared experience that bound communities together. The offerings made at the temple, whether in the form of food, amulets, or votive images of cats, were personal acts of devotion, but the festival itself was a reminder of collective belonging. In worshipping Bastet, Egyptians were also affirming their place within the social and cosmic order. The descriptions we have, largely from outsiders like Herodotus, may emphasize the more spectacular aspects, the drunkenness, the sexual overtones, the mass of people. But beneath these images lies a deeper truth about Egyptian religion. It was not only about fearing the gods or solemnly appeasing them, but also about celebrating life itself. Cats, as animals that embodied both independence and intimacy, became symbols of that joy. Bastet was the goddess who made the household fertile and safe, and her festivals were reminders that the world, despite its dangers, was also abundant and worth celebrating. The haunting question that remains is how much of this image is accurate. Did 700,000 truly gather at Bubastis? Was the festival as wild as Herodotus suggests, or did his Greek perspective emphasize aspects that shocked or amused his audience back home? Archaeology supports the importance of Bubastis but cannot confirm the scale of revelry. We are left with fragments, temple ruins, votive offerings, and the words of a traveller whose accounts mix observation with embellishment. As with so much in ancient history, the precise truth is beyond our reach. What we can say is that by the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era, Bubastis had become a city where cats were not just guardians of grain or symbols of divinity, but catalysts for one of the largest religious celebrations of the ancient world. What made a cat festival draw hundreds of thousands? It was the intertwining of devotion and joy, myth and politics, daily life and cosmic balance. At Bubastis, Egyptians found in Bastet not only a goddess to fear or revere, but one to celebrate. The cat, once a silent hunter in the granaries of Mesopotamia, had by now become a symbol of joy that could unite a nation in laughter, intoxication and song. How did cats leave Egypt to conquer the world? For thousands of years their story had been largely confined to the river valleys of the Near East and North Africa, where wild ancestors crept into early granaries and slowly became tolerated companions. But by the second millennium before the Common Era, the cat was no longer just a creature of fields and temples. It had become a passenger, carried deliberately and accidentally along the maritime arteries of the Mediterranean. This was not simply the spread of a species, but the start of a global journey that would, in time, make the domestic cat one of the most widespread carnivores on Earth. The earliest clear evidence for this mobility comes from Egypt. By around 1,500 years before the Common Era, cats were not only part of households and temples, but also companions aboard ships. Seafaring in antiquity was fraught with danger, storms, piracy, and shipwrecks. But the more mundane problem that every ship faced was rodents. Grain, dried fruit, and other provisions stored in wooden containers or amphorae attracted mice and rats, which could quickly infest a vessel and threaten its cargo. Cats, already honed by millennia of hunting rodents in village granaries, were a natural solution. Their presence aboard ships was practical before it was symbolic. Archaeological evidence supports this maritime role. Artistic depictions from Egypt show cats in domestic settings, but the extension to ships is inferred from the spread of their remains to places where they were not native. Cats appear in the Levant, on islands such as Cyprus and Crete, and in the Aegean world during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, between roughly 1,500 and 1,000 years before the Common Era. Genetic studies of ancient cat remains confirm that many of these animals carried the mitochondrial signatures of the Egyptian lineage, suggesting that cats moved not by natural dispersal across deserts and mountains, but by human transport over water. The Phoenicians, renowned sailors and traders from the Levant, may have played a particularly important role in this dispersal. Their networks reached across the Mediterranean, from the Levantine coast to North Africa, Iberia, and beyond. It is plausible that Phoenician ships carried cats as pest control, and that these animals disembarked or were exchanged in trading ports, slowly establishing populations far from their original range. Egyptian cats thus may have mingled with local wildcats in new territories, but their domestic tendencies, tolerance of people, willingness to live in settlements, helped them persist in human-dominated environments. By the first millennium before the Common Era, Greek sources begin to mention cats, though they often distinguish them from weasels and other small carnivores that had long been used to control vermin. In early Greek households, weasels may have been the primary rodent killers, but cats were clearly present by the classical period. Their path there likely began with Egyptian exports, both intentional and accidental. It is worth remembering that Egyptian law at times prohibited the export of cats, a measure reflecting both their sacred status and their practical value. Yet such prohibitions were easily circumvented. Historical accounts suggest cats were smuggled out of Egypt and traded to neighbouring cultures, a reminder that human fascination with these animals had already created a market. The spread of cats across the Mediterranean was not uniform. Some regions adopted them quickly, while others seem to have relied longer on local animals for pest control. the speed of their dispersal reflects not only human agency, but also the adaptability of the cat itself. Unlike dogs or cattle, cats required no pens or careful breeding to maintain their usefulness. A single pair brought aboard a ship could establish a population at a new port within a few breeding seasons, and their semi-wild nature allowed them to survive whether or not humans actively cared for them. One telling aspect of this maritime dispersal is the dual role of cats as both practical tools and cultural symbols. Egyptian sailors may have valued them primarily as hunters, but their religious associations could not have been entirely absent. To carry an animal associated with Bastet and divine protection may have seemed doubly useful, both pest control and spiritual safeguard. For Phoenician and Greek traders who encountered these cats, their foreign origins may have imbued them with exotic appeal, adding to the incentive to keep and breed them. Archaeozoological remains support this narrative. Cat bones have been found in sites across the Mediterranean dating to this period, often in contexts that suggest deliberate human introduction. For example, in the Levant, remains dated to the first millennium before the Common Era resemble Egyptian domestic cats rather than local wildcats, indicating import. On islands where no wildcats had lived, such as Crete and later Sardinia, the presence of cats is unambiguous evidence of human transport. This pattern of dispersal underscores a broader truth about the domestication of cats. They did not spread because they were forced, but because humans found them useful, and cats found human settlements profitable. The relationship was not one of strict control, but of mutual benefit. On ships, cats reduced infestations. In ports, they thrived on refuse and rodents. Their presence required little effort, and their survival instincts ensured persistence even in harsh conditions. By 500 years before the Common Era, cats were established in much of the Mediterranean basin. They appeared in Greek art and were gradually integrated into daily life. They were not yet the ubiquitous companions they would later become, but they had taken the crucial step of leaving their original homeland and embedding themselves in the trade networks that bound together the ancient world. From this point forward, the cat was no longer a regional species but a maritime traveller, a stowaway in the great experiment of human mobility. The haunting question is how deliberate this spread was. Did Egyptians and Phoenicians knowingly seed the Mediterranean with cats, trading them as valuable animals, or were they simply unintentional migrants that happened to survive voyages? The evidence suggests both. Some cats were clearly prized and exported despite official bans, while others likely wandered off ships in foreign ports and established themselves naturally. Either way, the result was the same. By the end of the first millennium before the Common Era, the cat had taken its first great leap beyond its ancestral range, setting the stage for a global dispersal that continues to shape human environments today. How did cats leave Egypt to conquer the world? They did so by ship, by trade, and by accident. They followed the grain and the sailors who carried it, stowed away in holds and prowled on deck, and in doing so they crossed boundaries their wild ancestors never could. They became not just Egyptian gods but Mediterranean travellers, a small predator turned into a global companion by the simplest of needs, to keep the food safe and the rats away. How did Romans really feel about cats? When we look at Roman mosaics, frescoes, and the scattered written sources, we find a complicated picture. Cats in the Roman world were neither worshipped in the divine sense as they had been in Egypt, nor dismissed as irrelevant. Instead, they occupied a middle ground, practical companions, admired for their hunting abilities, occasionally depicted in art, and slowly woven into household life. From the 5th century before the Common Era until the 1st century of the Common Era, the Roman adoption of cats not only reshaped their image, but also ensured their spread into continental Europe. Cats did not arrive in Italy overnight. Their presence in the Mediterranean, through Egyptian and Phoenician trade, made it inevitable that they would appear in Roman ports as the Republic expanded its naval and commercial reach. Archaeological remains from sites in Italy suggest that by the late Republic, around the 3rd century before the Common Era, cats were already living in domestic contexts. These animals were almost certainly descendants of the Felis silvestris libica lineage that had spread out of Egypt centuries earlier. The Egyptian ban on cat exportation had long been ignored, and by the time Rome became a dominant Mediterranean power, cats were effectively part of the common stock of trade goods and stowaways. In Roman households, cats were not always the primary animal for pest control. Weasels and ferrets had a long tradition in Europe of being used to hunt mice and rabbits, and these animals were valued for their agility and trainability. Yet cats had certain advantages. They could live independently in a home without constant supervision. They were quieter than weasels, and they carried with them the aura of exoticism. For a Roman matron in an urban domus or a rural villa, having a cat meant more than protection of grain stores. It was a marker of participation in a wider Mediterranean world where animals from Africa and the East were increasingly common. The art of the period provides glimpses of how cats were viewed. Roman mosaics sometimes show cats poised in the act of hunting birds or mice, their arched backs and extended claws frozen in stone. In these depictions, the cat is not merely ornamental, it is an agent of utility, a representation of vigilance within the household. Frescoes from Pompeii and Herculaneum occasionally include cats in domestic or market scenes, underscoring their role as familiar presences in daily life. The survival of these images suggests that by the 1st century of the Common Era, cats had become a recognisable symbol of domesticity in Roman culture. Religious currents also played a role in this adoption. The cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, became increasingly popular in Rome during the late Republic and early Empire. Temples dedicated to Isis appeared in cities across Italy, blending Egyptian ritual with Roman practice. While cats were not worshipped directly in these cults, their association with Egyptian religion likely carried over. A Roman worshipper of Isis would have been aware of the feline symbolism of Bastet and the protective qualities attributed to cats. Thus, even as the religious context shifted, the symbolic association of cats with fertility, guardianship and exotic mystique would have lingered. Still, Romans were practical people, and they valued animals primarily for their usefulness. Cats were kept to protect food stores from rodents, and the presence of cats in military camps and rural villas attests to their functional role. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, does not devote extended passages to cats, but his mention of their hunting ability confirms that they were known and valued. Other Roman writers are relatively silent, which itself tells us something. Cats were not extraordinary curiosities but had become ordinary integrated animals by the 1st century. The Roman military may have played a decisive role in spreading cats further into Europe. As legions marched across Gaul, Hispania and the Balkans, they brought with them supplies, merchants and animals. Rodents followed armies, thriving on grain wagons and supply depots. Cats, adept at following human settlements, likely spread alongside the troops. Whether intentionally brought as pest control or travelling as stowaways, their presence in Roman camps would have facilitated their establishment in new regions. Archaeological finds across the provinces confirm this dispersal. Cat bones dated to the late Republic and early Empire have been recovered from sites in Gaul and the Rhineland, regions far outside the original range of Felis sylvestris libica. These remains match the morphology of domestic cats rather than European wildcats, suggesting deliberate human transport. By the early centuries of the Common Era, cats were thus no longer confined to the Mediterranean basin. They had crossed into continental Europe, following Rome's networks of trade and conquest. The Roman attitude toward cats, however, remained pragmatic rather than reverential. Unlike dogs, which could be trained for war, hunting and companionship, cats resisted training. Their independence was both their strength and their weakness. Romans admired their hunting skill, but did not assign them the variety of roles that dogs enjoyed. This limited the extent of selective breeding and meant that Roman cats looked much the same as their Egyptian ancestors. They remained small, striped and functional. The great variety of coat colours and patterns we associate with modern cats would not emerge until much later, under the influence of medieval breeding. Yet in their ordinariness lay their success. Cats required little care, offered clear benefits and spread without difficulty. By the 1st century of the Common Era, they were part of Roman urban noise. The mewing of kittens in courtyards, the silent stalking of mice in granaries, the occasional scratch of claws on wooden beams. They were not celebrated in poetry as noble companions, nor were they demonized. They were simply there, folded into the rhythms of Roman life. The unresolved question is how Romans truly felt about cats on a personal level. Did they regard them with affection, or merely tolerance? The artistic evidence suggests some admiration, but the lack of extended literary testimony leaves us guessing. Perhaps Romans were bemused by cats' independence, appreciating their presence but not elevating them beyond their practical role. Or perhaps, in the private corners of homes that archaeology rarely illuminates, Roman families loved their cats as intimately as we do today. The absence of evidence does not mean absence of feeling. It only means we cannot recover it. How did Romans really feel about cats? The answer lies somewhere between utility and quiet companionship. They neither worshipped cats as gods nor dismissed them as pests. They adopted them, carried them across provinces, and in doing so transformed them into one of the most successful species to travel with human civilization. Rome did not invent the domestic cat, but it gave it a highway into Europe, embedding it in the daily life of millions. From this foundation, cats would soon leave their pawprints across Britain, Gaul and beyond, following empire and trade into every corner of the known world. How do we know when cats reached northern Europe? It is one thing to trace them through the Mediterranean, where trade and empire tied coast to coast, but another to see them appear on the windswept edges of Roman Britain, a world away from their ancestral deserts. The answer, unexpectedly, lies in a pawprint. Around the 1st century of the Common Era, a cat walked across a freshly made clay tile before it was baked. The print remained pressed into the surface, hardened by the kiln, and survived through centuries of burial until archaeologists uncovered it. That small, almost accidental indentation is one of the earliest clear signs that cats had not only entered Britain, but were already living close enough to human settlements to leave their traces on construction materials. The tile itself tells a larger story. In Roman Britain, clay tiles were used for floors, roofs, and hypercaust heating systems. They were made in workshops where wet clay was spread and cut, then left to dry before firing. It was during this vulnerable stage, when tiles lay exposed to the open air, that animals sometimes wandered across them. Archaeologists have found not just cat prints, but those of dogs, birds, and even children's feet impressed in the clay. These unintentional signatures capture a moment of daily life that written sources rarely record. And in the case of the cat, the pawprint is more than a curiosity. It is proof that cats were physically present in Britain by the time Rome had established its province there. Other evidence complements this accidental fossil. Cat bones have been excavated from Roman sites across Britain, including military forts, villas and urban centres. The remains are relatively sparse compared to those of dogs, which were more numerous and diverse, but they are consistent enough to indicate a feline presence. Morphological studies suggest that these were not native European wildcats, which also lived in the British Isles, but animals resembling the domestic lineage carried from the Mediterranean. Distinguishing between wildcats and imported domesticates is difficult because their bones are so similar, yet context helps. When cat bones appear in Roman rubbish pits, or associated with human dwellings, the case for them being household animals rather than hunted wild species strengthens. The introduction of cats into Britain fits into the wider pattern of Roman dispersal. As the empire expanded, it carried with it not only armies and administrators, but also an entire ecosystem of plants and animals. Wheat, grapes, chickens, rabbits, and ferrets all spread alongside Roman settlers. Cats, with their pest control abilities, were naturally part of this package. Grain shipments into Britain would have attracted rodents, and cats were the logical countermeasure. The fact that they also carried symbolic and cultural associations from the Mediterranean world only reinforced their place in Roman life. It is worth pausing to consider the climate. Cats had evolved in the arid landscapes of North Africa and the Near East. Britain was cold, wet and grey. Yet cats adapted with remarkable resilience. Their fur provided insulation, and their opportunistic hunting skills transferred seamlessly to the small mammals and birds of the northern countryside. The pawprint in clay may seem fragile, but it's evidence of a species that had no difficulty establishing itself in an alien environment. By the 1st century of the Common Era, cats were comfortable enough in Britain to wander casually across the work surfaces of tile makers. The presence of cats in Britain also raises questions about their role in society there. Did Romans keep them primarily as pest controllers, or did they begin to serve as companions? Evidence from Britain is thinner than from Egypt or Italy, but the pattern suggests practicality. Cats guarded food supplies in villas and settlements. They may have been tolerated in military camps where stored grain and rations required protection from mice. Their relatively small numbers compared to dogs imply that they were not as widely adopted as pets, but their spread suggests they were valued enough to be transported across the Channel. One intriguing dimension is the interaction between imported domestic cats and native European wildcats. Scotland, in particular, remained home to wildcat populations throughout antiquity. The two species are so closely related that interbreeding is possible, and in later centuries this would become a conservation problem, as wildcats hybridized with feral domestic cats. In the Roman period, we cannot say whether this happened, but the possibility adds another layer to the story. The pawprints in clay may belong to animals that were not only spreading across provinces, but also blending genetically with local populations. The archaeological record continues to grow. Excavations at sites like Silchester and Vindolanda have uncovered cat remains in contexts that suggest long-term residence. These bones, combined with the clay pawprints, paint a consistent picture. By the early centuries of the Common Era, cats were no longer confined to the Mediterranean core of the empire. They had reached the empire's farthest western and northern frontiers, and once established, they stayed. The descendants of those Roman cats would continue to populate Britain long after the legions withdrew. The haunting question is what those first Britons, both Roman settlers and local inhabitants, thought of cats. Did they admire their hunting skills? Did they see them as exotic creatures brought from warmer lands? Or did they barely notice them, regarding them as silent workers on the margins of urban and rural life? The absence of direct testimony leaves us guessing, but the archaeological traces speak clearly enough. Cats had arrived, and they left their mark not only in bones but in a single pawprint pressed into clay, a reminder that history is sometimes preserved in the smallest accidents. Why is the cat absent from the Bible? It is a question that has puzzled not only historians of religion, but also countless ordinary readers who, flipping through scripture, expect to see some mention of an animal so entwined with human life. After all, the Bible is filled with animals. Lions roar across its pages as symbols of strength and judgment. Lambs, sheep and goats dominate parables and sacrificial rituals. Dogs, snakes, camels, oxen, donkeys and even locusts appear with symbolic or practical meaning. Yet the cat, present in the daily lives of people in the ancient Near East and deeply sacred in neighbouring Egypt, is strikingly absent. This silence is not an accident. It reflects the complex cultural, religious and symbolic positioning of cats during the centuries when the Hebrew Bible and later Christian writings were composed and canonized. The absence is first noticeable in the Hebrew scriptures. In the texts that became the Old Testament, cats are simply not mentioned. Farmers and herders would have known of them. Grain storage and rodent control made their presence useful, but unlike sheep or goats, cats were never domesticated as herd animals. Unlike camels, they were not beasts of burden. Unlike dogs, they were not hunting companions. Their role in human society was largely silent, solitary and peripheral. This marginality may explain part of their textual omission. The Bible was a record deeply concerned with covenantal ritual, agriculture, sacrifice, and communal survival. Cats did not easily fit into those categories. There may also have been cultural reasons for exclusion. The Israelites lived in close proximity to Egypt, where cats were elevated to divine status as manifestations of Bastet and Sekhmet. Within Egyptian temples, cats were bred, mummified, and worshipped in ways that to Israelite eyes would have been foreign, perhaps even troubling. Biblical writers often went to great lengths to distinguish their practices from neighbouring religions. Just as prohibitions against pigs may have been sharpened by contrast with surrounding cultures, the deliberate omission of cats may have signalled resistance to Egyptian cultic practices. To include cats as symbols might have blurred lines with a faith community determined to remain distinct from the idolatry of its neighbours. When Christianity emerged centuries later, the silence remained. In the Gospels, Acts and Epistles, cats are still absent. Early Christian writers inherited the scriptures of Judaism and added new layers of meaning, but their symbolic vocabulary was drawn from the same Mediterranean world. They spoke of sheep and shepherds, wolves in sheep's clothing, and serpents as symbols of evil. Cats, though increasingly present in Roman households, had not yet acquired a secure symbolic role in Christian thought. Roman mosaics depict cats chasing birds or guarding food, showing they were well known in domestic settings. But Christian writers preferred to frame their teachings through animals that carried inherited resonance from Hebrew scriptures or Greco-Roman traditions. The ambiguity of the cat's position becomes sharper when we examine early Christian art and literature outside the canonical Bible. In apocryphal texts and later monastic writings, cats occasionally appear, often in anecdotal ways. Some desert fathers in Egypt mention cats prowling monasteries, tolerated as guardians against mice. In one charming story, a monk is said to have allowed a cat to sit beside him during prayer, a small detail illustrating humility and companionship. These glimpses show that cats were present in Christian environments, but had not yet acquired theological weight. They lived on the margins of the holy life, accepted for their practical value but rarely exalted in metaphor or allegory. Why does this matter? Because absence is itself a kind of presence. The silence of the Bible on cats tells us about the boundaries of religious imagination. By leaving cats unnamed, the texts left their meaning open to later reinterpretation. In the Middle Ages, this vacuum would be filled with suspicion, and cats would slide toward associations with heresy and witchcraft. But in the centuries between the birth of Christianity and the fall of the Roman Empire, the cat lived in a liminal space, useful, tolerated, but not celebrated. Archaeological evidence supports this picture. In sites across the Roman Near East, cat bones are found in domestic refuse. They were there, eating scraps, catching vermin, slipping through alleyways, but their bones were not ritually buried, nor were they depicted in Jewish or early Christian religious art. Contrast this with the abundance of feline imagery in Egyptian temples, or even the symbolic lions carved into Mesopotamian reliefs. The absence in Judeo-Christian contexts is conspicuous. It was not ignorance of the animal, but a decision not to include it in symbolic registers. One possible reason for this lies in the temperament of cats themselves. Unlike dogs, which demonstrate loyalty and obedience, cats remained aloof and independent. Their nocturnal habits, glowing eyes, and solitary hunting may have made them seem less trustworthy in a religious worldview that prized clarity, obedience, and communal roles. In texts that framed animals as teaching tools for human virtue or divine truth, cats offered little material. They could not be herded into parables like sheep. They could not be yoked into lessons like oxen. Their independence resisted easy moralization. This does not mean cats were ignored altogether in the broader cultural world. In Greek and Roman contexts, they appeared in art and domestic iconography. They were admired for their hunting prowess. Yet in the religious imagination of Judaism and Christianity, their absence persisted, and that silence laid the foundation for future ambiguity. By not being sanctified in Scripture, cats remained unmoored from protective symbolic frameworks. This neutrality made it easier for later generations to project fears or suspicions onto them. The haunting question is whether this silence was deliberate. Did biblical authors consciously avoid cats because of their Egyptian associations, or were cats simply too marginal in agrarian and symbolic life to warrant mention? We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that this omission shaped centuries of perception. The cat, absent from Holy Writ, hovered at the edges of sanctity, ready to be claimed by folklore, suspicion, or admiration, depending on the cultural moment. The story of the cat in religion is, at its root, a story of what is not said, and sometimes what is not said is as powerful as what is spoken. Why were cats allowed in mosques? It is a question that reveals much about how one great civilization thought about animals, purity, and companionship. In the centuries after the rise of Islam in the 7th century, cats found themselves not in silence, as they had in the biblical tradition, nor in the ambivalent admiration of Rome, but embraced as part of daily life in cities from Damascus to Baghdad, from Cairo to Cordoba. While Europe would later shroud cats in suspicion, linking them with witchcraft and the devil, the Islamic world gave them a place of respect, even affection. The cultural memory of that affection remains alive today in countless stories about the Prophet Muhammad and his fondness for cats, in the art and literature of the Caliphates, and in the simple fact that cats could often be found living inside mosques, tolerated by worshippers as part of the environment of prayer. The story begins with the Hadith literature, the collections of sayings and traditions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that formed a foundation for Islamic practice and ethics. Among these are stories of his cat, often named Muezza in later traditions, though this name does not appear in the earlier sources. In one of the most famous accounts, the Prophet is said to have been preparing for prayer, while his cat lay sleeping on the sleeve of his robe. Rather than disturb the animal, he cut the sleeve off so that the cat could continue to sleep undisturbed. Whether or not this particular story is historically verifiable, it circulated widely and carried enormous symbolic weight. It suggested that kindness to animals was not only permissible but admirable, even in the most mundane acts of daily life. This sentiment found strong resonance in the developing urban societies of the Caliphates. From the 8th to the 12th centuries, cities such as Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus and Cordoba were centres of scholarship, trade and art. They were also densely populated environments where food stores attracted rodents, just as they had in the Neolithic villages thousands of years earlier. Cats, by their very nature, offered a solution. Their rodent hunting skills made them valuable guardians of grain, libraries, and markets. Their tolerance for human proximity made them easy cohabitants of crowded quarters. The theological acceptance of cats as ritually clean animals only strengthened their presence. Unlike dogs, which Islamic law often regarded as impure, cats could enter mosques and homes without causing ritual contamination. This distinction profoundly shaped their social role. Historical sources describe cats roaming freely in mosques, sometimes fed by worshippers, sometimes simply tolerated as part of the living fabric of the sacred space. Theologians noted that cat hair did not nullify ritual purity in prayer, a subtle but important factor in why cats could dwell where dogs could not. In some cities, charitable endowments even supported feeding cats, recognizing them as part of the community. This practice illustrates a broader principle of Islamic ethics, the obligation of humans to treat animals with compassion. Cats became living examples of that principle in action, soft, visible reminders of mercy. Travellers' accounts confirm this role. In Cairo, chroniclers remarked upon the abundance of cats in mosques and streets, noting how easily they blended into daily life. In Damascus, cats were said to inhabit courtyards of learning institutions, tolerated by students and scholars alike. In Cordoba, which during the 10th century stood as one of the jewels of the Islamic world, cats walked the same marble courtyards as philosophers and poets. Their presence was unremarkable, which in itself is remarkable. While elsewhere cats could spark moral panic, here they were simply part of the city. This acceptance did not mean that cats were deified or raised to divine status, as they once had been in ancient Egypt. Islam's strict monotheism left no room for animal worship. But cats occupied a middle ground, valued, respected, and incorporated into human spaces. Their image occasionally appeared in art, though Islamic artistic conventions avoided naturalistic depictions of animals in religious contexts. Instead, cats appeared in poetry and anecdote, symbols of independence, grace, or quiet companionship. Writers drew on feline behaviour as metaphor, sometimes comparing scholars to cats in their patience and watchfulness. The contrast with Europe is striking. In the same centuries when Islamic cities were flourishing, European cats were often kept for rodent control but lacked the same level of symbolic affirmation. Over time, European suspicion would darken, but in the Caliphates, cats enjoyed continuity of presence. They were not feared as agents of witchcraft. They were not hunted or persecuted. They were partners in urban survival. Their clean habits, their ability to groom themselves and bury their waste, and their quiet integration into human life resonated with cultural ideals of order and propriety. One particularly enduring motif in Islamic law is the idea that cats were given a blessing by the Prophet himself. In some later traditions, he is said to have stroked a cat's back, leaving the distinctive M-shaped marking found on many tabby cats' foreheads. While this legend cannot be verified, it reveals the depth of cultural affection. The idea that the Prophet's touch marked cats permanently elevated their symbolic role. It transformed ordinary physical traits into signs of divine favour, linking every cat to the founder of the faith in popular imagination. From an ecological perspective, Cats in the Islamic world were perfectly positioned. Cities of the Caliphates were hubs of trade stretching from the Mediterranean to India, from North Africa to Central Asia. Cats likely travelled with merchants, sailors and scholars, further dispersing their populations. Their integration into Islamic society thus facilitated their global spread. While ships had long carried cats as rat catchers, the cultural acceptance of cats in Muslim ports made it easier for them to thrive and multiply. This practical dispersal worked in tandem with their symbolic role, making them both tools of urban hygiene and gentle presences in households and mosques. Yet even in this positive context, there were limits. Cats were not treated as family members in the way modern Western households might imagine. They were fed and tolerated, but not anthropomorphized. Their role was more practical and symbolic than deeply sentimental. The stories of the Prophet's affection shaped norms of kindness, but everyday relationships with cats remained grounded in utility. Still, compared to the suspicion cats later faced in Europe, their position in the Caliphates was one of remarkable stability and respect. The haunting question is whether this cultural trajectory could have influenced later European views had the channels of exchange been more open. When Christian Europe encountered the Islamic world through trade, diplomacy and conflict, many ideas crossed boundaries: mathematics, medicine, philosophy. But the affection for cats does not appear to have transferred in the same way. The biblical silence and the absence of positive Christian traditions left cats vulnerable to negative associations, while in the Islamic world the stories of Muhammad's gentleness created a protective framework. Thus, between 600 and 1200 of the Common Era, cats found one of their safest cultural homes. They walked in mosques without fear, dozed in courtyards of scholars, and slipped through the markets of bustling cities, their presence unremarkable but deeply woven into daily life. To this day, if one visits Istanbul or Cairo, the descendants of those caliphal cats can still be seen, lounging on mosque steps, weaving through crowds, fed by strangers without question. Their history in the Islamic world is a reminder that the same animal can mean radically different things in different cultural frames. In one place feared, in another beloved, and in yet another silently omitted from the sacred record. How did cats go from gods to devils? Few transformations in cultural memory are so sharp, so unsettling, and so historically consequential as the European reimagining of cats during the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. Between the 13th and the 17th centuries, the same animal that in Egypt had once symbolized divine guardianship, and in the Islamic world had wandered freely through mosques, came to be feared in much of Christian Europe as a servant of the devil. The story of how this happened is tangled in theology, folklore, and fear. It is also a reminder that animals are never just animals in human eyes. They are mirrors onto which societies project their own anxieties, hopes, and nightmares. The root of the suspicion lies partly in the symbolic silence of earlier Christian tradition. Unlike sheep or doves, cats had never been given a positive spiritual association in the Bible. When the medieval church sought metaphors for holiness, the cat was absent. But when it sought symbols of sin and danger, the cat was available. Their nocturnal habits, their ability to see in the dark, their independence from human control, and their sometimes unnervingly direct gaze made them easy candidates for suspicion. By the 12th century, texts already associated cats with heretics. Chroniclers accused certain sects, like the Cathars, of kissing the hindquarters of a black cat in blasphemous rituals, though such claims almost certainly say more about the anxieties of the chroniclers than about any real practice. By the 13th century, the demonization deepened. In 2 papal bulls, Pope Gregory IX condemned groups accused of devil worship, and cats appeared in descriptions of their supposed rites. The notion of cats as diabolical companions began to take root in the European imagination. This was not about empirical observation of animals, it was about symbolic association. The independent, nocturnal, and elusive qualities of cats made them fit images of the devil, who was likewise imagined as prowling unseen. And if dogs had long been imagined as loyal to man, cats seemed loyal to no one, which in a world that valued hierarchy and obedience raised suspicion. The rise of witch trials in the 14th through 17th centuries cemented the link between cats and the demonic. Accusations against women often included the claim that they kept a familiar, a spirit in animal form that assisted in magical practices. Cats, especially black cats, were the most common familiars in these accusations. They were said to suckle on witches' blood, to carry out curses, to whisper satanic instructions in the night. In reality, of course, cats simply shared homes with people, especially women who often lived alone or in poverty. But in the fevered atmosphere of the witch hunts, a widow's companion animal could be transformed in the imagination of her neighbours into evidence of her pact with the devil. The consequences were dire. Cats were tortured, burned, and hanged alongside their human companions. Mass killings of cats were recorded in several towns during witch panics. In France, in Germany, and in parts of England, festivals sometimes included the burning of cats as symbols of evil. These were not isolated acts of cruelty, but communal rituals that reinforced the association of cats with danger and heresy. For centuries, fear reshaped the way people looked at the ordinary animal that prowled the barn or sat on the hearth. It is important to note that this demonization was not universal across all of Europe. In some rural areas, cats continued to be tolerated as rodent catchers. In some noble households, they remained curiosities or even pets. The record is mixed, as history usually is. Yet the dominant cultural narrative was one of fear. To be seen with a cat could be suspicious. To keep a black cat could be dangerous. Stories circulated that the devil himself appeared in feline form, slinking through doorways or perching on the shoulder of his servants. Paintings and woodcuts from the 16th century depict witches surrounded by cats, reinforcing the association visually for an illiterate public. Why did this transformation happen when it did? Scholars suggest several overlapping causes. One was the general climate of fear in late medieval Europe. Plagues, wars, and famines left societies searching for scapegoats. Another was the growing effort by church authorities to suppress folk practices and enforce orthodoxy. Cats had long been linked in folklore to female independence and sexuality. They became symbols of precisely the kind of uncontrolled life the church sought to discipline. Their nocturnal hunting echoed the imagined nocturnal gatherings of witches. Their independence from human command mirrored the independence feared in women who lived outside patriarchal norms. There is a paradox here worth pausing on. The very qualities that had once made cats valuable, their ability to hunt unseen, their comfort in the dark, their self-sufficiency, became reinterpreted as signs of danger. The ecological role of cats had not changed. The human interpretation had. In this sense, the story of medieval cats is less about the animals than about human fear of what escapes control. When societies felt fragile, the cat's aloof gaze became unbearable. One haunting question lingers. What might have happened had different traditions prevailed? In the Islamic world of the same centuries, cats remained accepted and respected. The stories of the Prophet Muhammad's kindness created a buffer against demonization. In Europe, by contrast, the silence of the Bible and the anxieties of the church left cats vulnerable. These two cultural paths illustrate how deeply human narratives shape the fate of animals. The same feline grace that inspired reverence in Egypt, that inspired affection in the Caliphates, inspired fear in medieval Christendom. The era of witch trials and familiar spirits did lasting damage to cats' reputation. Even today, echoes remain in the superstition that a black cat crossing one's path brings bad luck. These ideas are cultural fossils, remnants of centuries when cats were imagined as agents of evil. And yet, remarkably, cats survived this period. They were too useful, too adaptable, too numerous to vanish under the weight of superstition. Even as some were killed in ritual or suspicion, others continued to prowl barns and kitchens, tolerated for their utility. Their survival is a testament to resilience, both ecological and symbolic. By the 17th century, the intensity of witch hunts began to fade. Rationalist thought and changing legal standards eroded the plausibility of mass accusations. Cats, though still shadowed by superstition, began to reclaim their place as ordinary animals in European life. But the scars of the demonization remain in our cultural imagination. The witch's cat, the Halloween familiar, the black silhouette against the moon, all trace their lineage to these centuries of fear. And so, the haunting question remains. What does it say about us that the same animal can be seen as divine, beloved, or demonic, depending on time and place? The answer is not about cats themselves. It is about the human need to project meaning onto the creatures around us. Cats did not change. We did. Did killing cats make the plague worse? It is one of those unsettling questions where history, ecology, and fear collide. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe faced the most devastating pandemic in its recorded history, the Black Death. Beginning around the year 1347 and sweeping across the continent in waves, it killed tens of millions of people, reshaping societies for centuries. The plague was carried by fleas that lived on rodents, particularly the black rat, Rattus rattus, which thrived in human settlements. But one of the darker twists in this story is that the very animal capable of keeping rat populations in check had, by this time, been persecuted and diminished. The suspicion and destruction of cats that had become widespread in the late medieval period may have contributed to an ecological imbalance that worsened the impact of the plague. We must tread carefully here, because the historical record is patchy and the dynamics of medieval disease are complex. It would be too simple to say that the plague happened because Europeans killed cats. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused the Black Death, required a web of ecological and social conditions to spread: trade routes, dense urban populations, and rodent hosts. Yet when we step back and look at the broader picture, the timing of cat persecution and the explosion of rat-borne disease creates a troubling connection. The very superstition that casts cats as agents of the devil may have inadvertently weakened one of humanity's best lines of natural defence against vermin. When plague ships first docked in Sicily and Italy in the late 1340s, they carried more than merchants and cargo. Rats nested in the holds, and fleas carried the pathogene from rodent to rodent. From these Mediterranean ports, the disease spread rapidly northward and westward, carried along trade routes into France, Spain, the Low Countries, Germany, and eventually Britain and Scandinavia. The speed of its expansion was extraordinary, suggesting that the ecological conditions were already ripe for an epidemic. Rats were plentiful in medieval cities, which were characterized by wooden houses, thatched roofs, grain storage, and refuse in the streets. Without effective sanitation, rats flourished, and with fewer cats to control them, they may have flourished even more. By the 14th century, suspicion of cats in Europe was deeply ingrained. As covered earlier, witchcraft trials and theological condemnations had linked cats with evil. Mass killings of cats were not uncommon, whether through ritual burnings, local festivals, or simple fear. Written accounts describe cats being thrown into bonfires in towns during certain celebrations. Archaeological finds also suggest spikes in mass cat killings in some regions. The result was a population decline of domestic cats, at least in some parts of Europe. While cats were never eradicated, many households surely continued to keep them. The climate of fear created gaps in the predator-prey balance. Rats, freed from some of their most effective predators, found easier access to food stores and homes. Grain, a staple of medieval diets, was often stored in bins and sacks vulnerable to infestation. Cats would normally have prowled granaries and kitchens, keeping rat populations under constant pressure. Remove the cats, and rodents multiplied unchecked. Fleas, in turn, multiplied on the rats. When plague arrived, the ecological chain was primed for rapid spread. The haunting irony is that superstition drove people to destroy the very animals that might have shielded them. Fear of witches and the devil turned cats into scapegoats, and in killing them, humans may have given freer rein to the true enemy, disease-carrying rodents. This is not to suggest that cats alone could have stopped the plague. The Black Death was too vast, too entrenched in the social and ecological fabric of Eurasia. But in towns where cats were suppressed, rat populations likely faced less predation. Every increase in rats meant more fleas, more opportunities for Yersinia pestis to leap to humans. Modern epidemiology supports this interpretation, though with caution. Mathematical models of predator-prey dynamics show that removing a predator species can cause a spike in prey populations, which in turn destabilizes ecosystems. Medieval Europe offers a case study. Written chronicles do not often make the connection, but the timing is suggestive. When fear of cats reached its peak, the plague soon followed. The coincidence may not be coincidence at all. Consider too the psychological impact. In a world reeling from pandemic, the killing of cats did not stop. In fact, it sometimes intensified, because when the plague struck, people sought explanations. If cats were already suspected of demonic associations, it was easy to imagine that they carried the disease. In reality, the killing of cats during the plague years may have further worsened the ecological imbalance. Rats were left even freer to breed. The tragedy of misunderstanding compounded itself. The question of causality will likely never be answered definitively. There are many uncertainties. For one, not all forms of plague transmission require rats. Pneumonic plague can pass directly between humans, and recent studies suggest that in some outbreaks, human ectoparasites like lice may also have played a role. Moreover, cats themselves are not immune to plague. In later centuries they were documented as victims of infection. The dynamics are complex, and historians must be careful not to oversimplify. Still, the ecological argument remains persuasive. Persecuting cats removed an important predator from human settlements just when rodents posed their greatest danger. The Black Death transformed Europe. Entire villages were abandoned, economies collapsed, labour shortages reshaped social structures, and faith in institutions was shaken. In that maelstrom, the fate of cats is a footnote, but a revealing one. It shows how cultural beliefs can have unintended ecological consequences. By interpreting cats as symbols of evil rather than as allies in pest control, medieval Europeans may have undermined their own resilience. The lesson echoes far beyond the 14th century. Our treatment of animals shapes our vulnerability to disease. Ecological balance is not just a matter of nature, it is also a matter of culture. One image lingers from this period. In some towns, records describe piles of cats burned in public squares while plague ravaged the population. It is a grim paradox. People were trying to protect themselves by purging evil, yet in doing so, they may have made their world more dangerous. To imagine the empty barns, the grain bins teeming with rats, the fleas biting in the night, it is to glimpse how fragile human survival is when fear outweighs understanding. And the haunting question remains, what if the cats had been left alone? Would the plague have been less catastrophic? We cannot know. The mortality of the 14th century was driven by many factors, from climate shifts to trade networks. But perhaps, just perhaps, the silent absence of cats in many towns tilted the balance further toward disaster. It is a sobering reminder that animals are not just symbols in human stories, they are actors in ecological dramas that determine life and death. Which animals travelled the world on ships besides rats? The answer, often overlooked in stories of daring voyages and global trade, is the cat. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, the age of exploration reshaped the planet. Empires reached across oceans, new trade routes bound continents together, and along with spices, silver and disease came a small stowaway and shipmate, the domestic cat. At first glance it may seem almost trivial compared to the monumental consequences of exploration, but the presence of cats on ships was not only practical, it was transformative. Cats became indispensable companions in maritime life, and by travelling with sailors, they extended their range to every continent except Antarctica. The problem was rats. For as long as ships had carried grain, food, and cargo, rodents had followed. Ships were essentially floating pantries, sacks of grain, salted meats, crumbs scattered in corners. Rats multiplied with ease, gnawing through ropes, chewing wooden barrels and spreading disease. Sailors quickly learned that where rats went, misery followed. Cats were the answer. Brought aboard as pest control, they patrolled the decks and holds with silent precision, reducing rodent populations and preserving stores. It was not a new relationship. Cats had been associated with granaries and human food storage for thousands of years. But now, in the age of oceanic navigation, their hunting skills took on a global dimension. Records from the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch and later English voyages note the presence of cats on long journeys. Some of these cats were likely brought deliberately, others perhaps slipped aboard as stowaways. Either way, once at sea they proved their worth. Cats could adapt to shipboard life in ways that few animals could. Dogs might be loyal companions, but feeding them required more resources. Cats fed themselves in part by hunting vermin. They took up little space, tolerated confinement, and bred quickly, ensuring new generations could replace those lost at sea. Their claws and balance made them remarkably adept at navigating the rolling decks and rigging of ships. This role as maritime pest controllers had consequences far beyond the vessels themselves. Every time a ship docked in a port, cats had opportunities to slip ashore or be carried off by sailors and settlers. In this way, cats expanded their range from the Mediterranean and Eurasia to the Americas, to islands in the Pacific, and to distant coasts of Africa and Asia. Archaeological evidence shows cats appearing in new regions precisely in the centuries when European ships were first arriving. By the 17th century, cats were established in the Caribbean, in coastal colonies of the Americas, and on islands like the Azores and Madeira. Some of these introductions were beneficial, at least from the human perspective. Colonists valued cats for the same reason sailors did. They kept rodent populations in check in settlements where food supplies were vulnerable. But the ecological impact could be more complicated. On isolated islands, cats became invasive predators, hunting birds and small mammals that had no defences against them. Entire species, especially ground-nesting birds, were put at risk. The history of cats in the Age of Exploration is thus a double-edged tale. On one hand, practical partnership with humans. On the other, ecological disruption in environments unprepared for their arrival. In the journals of explorers, cats occasionally surface as more than tools. Sailors often grew attached to their ship's cats, naming them, treating them as mascots, and noting their presence during difficult journeys. Folklore grew around them too. Cats were thought to bring luck, or to predict weather by the way they washed their faces or arched their backs. Some seafarers believed a ship's cat could calm storms, others that its anger might provoke one. A few myths even imagine cats as guardians against witches or as creatures with supernatural influence over the sea. Whether feared or cherished, their presence was undeniable. When we consider the great voyages of this period, the Portuguese around Africa, Columbus crossing the Atlantic, Magellan's circumnavigation, it is tempting to focus solely on human actors. Yet at the margins of these events padded quiet paws. When Europeans settled in the Americas, cats went with them. When trading posts were founded in Asia, cats soon appeared in the alleys. When Dutch merchants established themselves in Indonesia and Japan, cats adapted to their new surroundings. The spread of cats mirrors the spread of European power and trade, though the cats themselves were not bound by politics. They were simply following food, people, and opportunity. What makes this period unique is not only the expansion of cats' range, but the speed and scale of it. In previous millennia, cats had spread slowly, carried by farmers, traders, and migrants across land and short sea routes. Now, within a few generations, they leapt oceans. They did not merely cross the Mediterranean or the Red Sea. They crossed the Atlantic and Pacific. They became global in the truest sense. By the year 1600, cats lived on multiple continents far from their original homelands in North Africa and Southwest Asia. The Age of Exploration also transformed human societies, and cats were part of that transformation. In colonial settlements, cats became part of everyday domestic life, marking the transition from temporary encampments to permanent homes. In trade ports, they served as common companions in taverns, warehouses, and markets. Their status varied, sometimes cherished pets, sometimes tolerated workers, but they were always present. They became symbols of both comfort and pragmatism in an uncertain world. Of course, from an ecological perspective, their spread had lasting consequences. On islands such as New Zealand or the Galapagos, cats preyed on native species with devastating results. In many cases, the introduction of cats by European ships contributed to the decline or extinction of birds that had never before encountered mammalian predators. These unintended consequences are a reminder that domesticated animals, once mobile with humans, could alter ecosystems in profound and sometimes irreversible ways. Sailors and settlers of the time could not have foreseen this. For them, cats were simply helpful allies. But the long echo of those voyages includes both companionship and ecological disruption. It is worth remembering that during this same period, rats were also spreading with ships, often with equal or greater impact on ecosystems and human health. Cats and rats, age-old adversaries, travelled together, their struggle exported across oceans. Sometimes cats succeeded in holding back rat populations in new settlements. Sometimes the rats overwhelmed them. Either way, the global journeys of humans had brought both species into landscapes far from where they evolved. So when we ask which animals travelled the world on ships besides rats, the cat stands out not only for its ubiquity, but for the quiet role it played in shaping global history. It was the predator in the hold, the comfort on a stormy night, the passenger that left the ship and never returned, the settler that carved out a new niche. The age of exploration was not just about empires and economies, it was also about the spread of living companions whose stories intertwined with ours. And the haunting question remains, when humans set sail to conquer the oceans, did cats conquer us instead? For while we thought we were carrying them as pest control, it was they who hitched a ride into every corner of the world, securing a global presence without ever asking permission. When did cats stop working and start lounging? The question might seem playful, but it marks a genuine turning point in the history of human-cat relations. For millennia, cats had been tolerated and valued primarily as hunters of rodents, whether in the fields of the Fertile Crescent, the temples of Egypt, the ships of explorers, or the warehouses of Europe. Their role was practical, their presence justified by utility. Yet by the 18th century, a cultural shift was underway in Europe. Cats were no longer seen only as mousers or as suspicious animals linked with witchcraft and misfortune. Instead, they began to move into parlors, bedrooms, and family portraits, making the transition from workers to companions. This shift was not sudden, nor was it uniform across all of Europe. In rural communities, cats still performed much the same tasks they always had. Barn cats lived largely outdoors, hunting rodents around food stores and outbuildings. But in urban centres, particularly among the growing middle classes and elites, cats began to be accepted indoors as pets. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on observation, natural history, and changing ideas of domestic life, provided a cultural climate in which cats could reinvent their role. Writers and philosophers of the 18th century sometimes remarked on the cat's peculiar charm. The French naturalist Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, devoted pages to cats in his Histoire naturelle, published in the 1750s. He described them as creatures of grace and independence, albeit sometimes with a streak of cruelty. Buffon's observations carried influence across Europe, shaping perceptions of cats not simply as vermin control, but as fascinating subjects in their own right. At the same time, other Enlightenment thinkers highlighted animals as companions and participants in human domestic life, softening earlier prejudices that had linked cats with sorcery or misfortune. Art of the period reinforces this change. In Dutch and French paintings of the 17th century, cats often appear in kitchen or barn scenes, associated with disorder or thievery, stealing a fish or a piece of bread. But by the 18th century, British and French artists increasingly placed cats within family portraits or intimate domestic scenes. They appeared on laps, by fireplaces, and alongside children, suggesting not suspicion, but affection. A subtle shift in iconography reflected a deeper social change. Cats were becoming acceptable as household companions. The rise of bourgeois domestic ideals in this period also played a role. The 18th century saw the growing importance of the home as a centre of moral and emotional life, particularly for the emerging middle classes. Pets fit into this new vision of domesticity, embodying values of comfort, nurture, and family cohesion. Dogs had long held this role, but cats began to follow, especially as their reputation for independence and cleanliness made them appealing in urban households. They could share indoor spaces without the same demands as dogs for constant attention or exercise. At the same time, scientific interest in animals was expanding. Natural history collections, menageries, and zoological works paid increasing attention to species that had once been overlooked. The cat, once dismissed as too ordinary or too sinister, now received more study. Travellers described cats in distant colonies, noting variations in size or colour. While this was not yet the era of formalised cat breeds, it laid groundwork for thinking of cats as diverse and individual creatures rather than interchangeable mouses. Literature, too, reveals the changing role of cats. In England, writers such as Samuel Johnson kept and remarked on cats, sometimes with affection. Anecdotes of cherished cats circulated in letters and journals, indicating a growing tendency to treat them as valued companions. By the late 18th century, sentimental stories of cats appeared in popular almanacs and magazines. Where once cats had been feared as omens, they now featured in moral tales of loyalty and kindness. Not everyone embraced this shift. Some writers continued to view cats with suspicion, emphasizing their aloofness compared to dogs. In certain rural or conservative circles, old associations with witchcraft lingered. But overall, the cultural balance was tilting. Increasingly, cats were tolerated indoors, admired for their elegance, and spoken of in terms of companionship. This transition also intersected with broader changes in attitudes toward animals. The 18th century witnessed the beginnings of animal welfare movements in Europe. Concerns about cruelty, especially in urban settings where animals were often mistreated, led to the first campaigns for more humane treatment. Within this climate, treating cats as members of the household, rather than expendable workers or nuisances, aligned with a broader moral trend. To welcome a cat into the parlour was not only an act of comfort, but part of a growing ethic of compassion toward animals. By the end of the 18th century, cats had carved out a new place in European society. They were still hunters in barns and alleys, still passengers on ships, but they were also companions, curling on cushions, appearing in portraits, and inspiring affection. Their ambiguous reputation had softened, and their role had diversified. The haunting question remains, what changed first, the cat or the human? Did cats adapt their behaviour, becoming more tolerant of close indoor living, or did humans simply reinterpret the same feline traits in a new cultural light? Perhaps both occurred together, as centuries of proximity slowly rewrote mutual expectations. From pest control to parlours, the 18th century marks the moment when cats began to step fully into the role they still occupy today. Not just hunters at the edges of human society, but companions at its heart. Why did the tabby cat not exist in the form we know until the Middle Ages? It is a curious puzzle, because for thousands of years cats had already lived alongside humans. They guarded the granaries of Mesopotamia, stalked the alleys of Jericho, crossed the Mediterranean on ships and lounged in Egyptian temples. Yet in all the art, sculpture and written accounts of cats from those long centuries, the familiar blotched or striped patterns that fill our homes today are absent. Ancient cats, like their Near Eastern wildcat ancestors, largely wore coats of pale, sandy colour, marked only with narrow vertical stripes, the so-called mackerel tabby pattern. The swirling blotches and dots that define the modern tabby only begin to appear relatively late in the historical record, and their story is one of genetics, trade, and the slow, unintentional shaping of domestication. The genetic clue lies in a mutation of a single gene called TACPEP, short for transmembrane aminopeptidase Q. This gene influences coat pattern by controlling how pigment cells are distributed during embryonic development. In wildcats, the dominant form of the gene produces narrow vertical stripes well suited for camouflage in tall grasses and scrub. But at some point, probably in the first millennium of the Common Era, a new variant emerged that altered this system, producing bold blotches, wider stripes, and spots that look very different from the subtle camouflage of a wildcat. Unlike deliberate breeding in dogs, which dramatically reshape their bodies and temperaments, this feline change spread gradually, unnoticed at first. Cats remained cats, but their coats began to tell a story of subtle genetic drift. Where did this happen? Evidence points towards Southwest Asia, particularly the Ottoman world. By the Middle Ages, cats had spread through trade routes that linked the Islamic Caliphates, Byzantium, and later the Ottoman Empire to Europe and Africa. In this interconnected world, cats travelled on ships, in caravans, and in the homes of merchants. A tabby coat mutation that appeared in one local population could therefore spread widely, carried silently in the litters of cats that followed trade networks. Archaeogenetic studies comparing ancient remains to modern DNA suggest that the blotched tabby pattern may have first become common in the eastern Mediterranean before moving steadily westward. Art gives us supporting evidence. In Egyptian and Roman depictions, cats are almost always shown with narrow stripes resembling the African wildcat. The earliest known illustration of a blotched or classic tabby pattern appears only in the late Middle Ages, in manuscripts and paintings from Southwest Asia, and later in European works. By the 14th century, cats with bolder markings occasionally appear in illustrated bestiaries and illuminated manuscripts. By the 16th century, tabby cats were depicted more regularly, and by the 18th century, they had become familiar enough to be associated with domestic pets in Europe. This timeline raises an intriguing question. Why did the mutation become widespread only in the medieval period, long after cats had already dispersed across much of the Old World? The answer may lie in how cats were treated by humans. For thousands of years, cats domesticated themselves through a commensal relationship. They approached human settlements for food, tolerated our presence, and were tolerated in return. Unlike dogs, they were not subject to intense selective breeding. Humans did not shape their appearance until very recently. But as urban life expanded in the medieval era, and as cats increasingly shared indoor spaces, traits that marked them out visually may have been favoured, consciously or unconsciously. People may have found blotched or spotted coats attractive, and cats with these mutations may have been more likely to be cared for, fed, and passed along to new households. The rise of the Ottoman Empire may have accelerated this process. Cats were valued in Islamic culture for their cleanliness and their role in controlling vermin. Stories of the Prophet Muhammad's affection for cats helped cement their status as welcome companions in homes and even mosques. Within such an environment, cats were free to reproduce in large numbers, and distinctive coat patterns could spread rapidly. From the Ottoman heartlands, maritime and overland trade carried these cats westward, introducing blotched tabbies into European ports and cities. By the 18th century, naturalists began to notice and comment on the variety of cat coat patterns. Buffon and others described not only the sandy stripe type but also the blotched, marbled forms that were becoming increasingly common in European households. By the 19th century, when the first cat shows and breed societies appeared, the tabby pattern was so established that it became the most recognised of domestic cat markings, still dominant among household pets today. The Tabby Takeover thus represents one of the few visible markers of cat domestication. Unlike dogs, which underwent dramatic changes in skull shape, size and behaviour, cats remain strikingly similar to their wild ancestors. The tabby pattern tells us that while humans may not have intentionally bred cats for specific jobs, our presence shaped their genetics nonetheless. Living near people provided survival advantages, and human preference may have tilted the balance towards certain appearances. The haunting question is why this genetic change came so late. Did it exist earlier, but remain rare until the right social and cultural conditions allowed it to flourish? Or was the Middle Ages simply the moment when a random mutation appeared and happened to coincide with a global web of trade that ensured its survival? As with much of cat history, we cannot answer with certainty. What we can say is that the coats of the animals in our homes today carry with them the memory of a genetic shift that unfolded quietly in the medieval centuries, reshaping the very look of the domestic cat. When did people first look at a cat and decide that its beauty alone was reason enough to shape its future? For thousands of years, cats had followed us, lived among us, and guarded our food. They had slipped into myth in Egypt, into suspicion in medieval Europe, into households during the Enlightenment. But until the 19th century, no one had systematically bred cats for appearance or organised competitions to decide which was most appealing. The Victorian age changed that. The same century that brought industrial smoke, telegraphs and railways also brought the curious invention of the cat fancy. It was a movement that took cats off the street and placed them on velvet cushions under the judging eye of human taste. The first great cat show is usually dated to London in the year 1868, held at the Crystal Palace, that vast glass exhibition hall originally built for the Great Exhibition. Organised by Harrison Weir, an artist, naturalist and passionate animal lover, the event brought together dozens of cats from across Britain. They were displayed in cages, each with information about age, sex and category. Visitors could walk through the rows, marvelling at Persians with long flowing coats, at compact British shorthairs, at unusual colour varieties that until then had been little more than curiosities. The show was, by all accounts, a sensation. Thousands came, newspapers wrote admiringly about the animals, and a precedent was set. Cats could be judged like cattle, horses or dogs, not for utility but for beauty. The Victorians were primed for this shift. Britain in the 19th century was obsessed with classification, order and improvement. This was the age of Charles Darwin and On the Origin of Species, the age of natural history museums, the age of selective breeding in agriculture that promised to improve everything from sheep's wool to roses in the garden. Dogs had already been subject to directed breeding for centuries, producing recognisable types for hunting, guarding, or companionship. Cats, until now, had largely been left to their own devices. The cat fancy was the first deliberate attempt to change that, to mould felines into predictable, recognisable forms that could be named, catalogued, and celebrated. Breeds began to crystallise. The Persian, with its long fur and flattened face, became one of the earliest and most fashionable. Its exotic origins were emphasised in exhibition catalogues, though the cats shown in London were almost certainly local animals selectively bred for length of coat rather than true imports. The British Shorthair, solid and round-faced, was celebrated as the archetypal domestic cat of the Isles. Siamese cats, with their pale bodies and dark points, were introduced to Britain in the late 19th century, quickly fascinating audiences with their striking coloration and foreign allure. Maine Coons, Angoras, Russian Blues, names multiplied, and along with them grew the idea that cats were not just household companions, but pedigreed creatures with lineages worth recording. Organisations formed to give structure to this enthusiasm. The National Cat Club was founded in Britain in the 1880s, establishing standards for breeds and organising shows. Stud books were kept, recording lineages and helping to stabilise traits. The emphasis was firmly on appearance, coat length, colour, pattern, eye shape, body proportions. Unlike dogs, whose breeds were often tied to specific working functions, cats were bred almost exclusively for how they looked. In this sense, the cat fancy was a purely aesthetic project, reflecting Victorian ideals of refinement, exoticism, and status. Not everyone approved. Some naturalists worried that selective breeding might weaken cats, making them less effective hunters or more prone to disease. Others mocked the idea of pampering animals that had for so long lived independently, dismissing the shows as frivolous spectacles for bored city dwellers. But for many Victorians, the appeal was irresistible. To own a rare breed was to participate in a new culture of refinement, much like collecting orchids or breeding fancy pigeons. It was a sign of status, education, and modernity. The shows themselves reveal much about changing human-cat relationships. In earlier centuries, cats were tolerated or feared, occasionally loved, but rarely celebrated. In the Crystal Palace, they became objects of admiration, placed on display for their elegance. Reports from the first shows describe Persians combed and brushed for hours, their fur fluffed to perfection, while Siamese cats drew crowds simply for their unusual looks. The judges awarded prizes, visitors debated merits, and the press printed descriptions of winners. Cats, in short, had become celebrities. This new obsession spread quickly beyond Britain. Cat shows were organised in France, Belgium, and the United States by the end of the 19th century. The American Cat Association was founded in 1899, reflecting similar interests across the Atlantic. Illustrated books appeared with lavish drawings of cat breeds, and owners commissioned portraits of their prized animals. The cat fancy had become a transnational movement, carried by urban elites who found in the cat both a symbol of domesticity and an exotic companion. But beneath the glamour lay a more complicated truth. Selective breeding also introduced health problems, some of which remain with us today. The distinctive flattened face of the Persian, so prized by Victorian judges, is associated with breathing difficulties and eye problems. The pursuit of unusual coat colours sometimes led to inbreeding, narrowing genetic diversity. Cats that had once been robust generalists now began to diverge into specialised lines that, while beautiful, were more vulnerable. This tension between aesthetic preference and animal welfare was not always recognised at the time, but has become a central question in modern cat breeding. Why did the Victorians take this step when so many previous cultures had not? Part of the answer lies in industrialisation. With more people living in cities and less direct need for cats as pest controllers, their role shifted. They became companions in parlours, curled up on upholstered furniture, part of a new middle-class ideal of domestic comfort. The culture of display that flourished in industrial exhibitions and world's fairs naturally extended to pets. If machines, textiles, and flowers could be exhibited and judged, why not cats? Another part lies in Victorian fascination with classification. Scientists and amateurs alike collected, catalogued, and compared specimens of everything from beetles to birds. Cats fit neatly into this mindset. To describe, name, and order them into breeds was a way of asserting control and knowledge over the natural world. At the same time, the exotic origins of some breeds satisfied imperial appetites for the foreign and unusual. A Siamese cat in a London show was a living piece of empire, a symbol of global reach brought home and tamed. The 19th century also saw the rise of animal welfare movements, including the founding of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in 1824. Paradoxically, the cat fancy both reflected this growing concern for animal well-being and sometimes conflicted with it. On the one hand, keeping and breeding cats as valued companions demonstrated care and affection. On the other, the pursuit of extreme traits sometimes compromised their health. This duality continues to shape debates around pet breeding today. By the close of the 19th century, the cat fancy had transformed the domestic feline. Once largely undifferentiated, cats were now divided into breeds with names, standards, and lineages. The image of the pampered Persian on a velvet cushion had entered popular imagination. The groundwork had been laid for the modern world of cat shows, registries, and breed clubs that still thrive. The haunting question is whether this shift truly changed cats, or whether it mostly changed how we see them. Cats themselves remained remarkably independent, still capable of living feral lives if abandoned, still hunters at heart. Yet in the Victorian era, we began to project onto them our own ideals of beauty, order, and status. That act of projection marked a turning point in the long story of human-cat relations, one that continues to shape the breeds we admire and the pets we invite into our homes today. Are cats even domesticated at all? It is a deceptively simple question, one that should have a straightforward answer. After all, the domestic cat has been given a Latin name, Felis catus, and sits in veterinary textbooks alongside clearly domesticated species like Canis familiaris, the dog, or Bos taurus, the cow. Yet when biologists have examined the modern cat genome in the last 2 decades, they have found something unsettling. Unlike dogs, who show thousands of years of directed selection for traits that humans needed, cats remain remarkably similar to their wild cousins. Their genome has hardly shifted. Their skeleton is almost identical to the Near Eastern wildcat from which they descend, and their behaviour retains a feral resilience that no amount of breeding has erased. To study the cat is to realise that domestication is not a simple binary. It is a spectrum, and cats occupy its margins, balancing between wild autonomy and human companionship, with a confidence that makes them unique among the animals we call ours. The first major attempt to map the cat genome came in the early 2000s, when geneticists began sequencing both domestic breeds and wild relatives. The results were surprising. While domestic cats could clearly be traced back to a single ancestor, Felis silvestris libica, the Near Eastern wildcat, there were far fewer differences than expected. Where the dog genome showed signatures of selection in hundreds of genes related to digestion, cognition, and social behaviour, cats displayed only modest shifts in a handful of regions. Many of those changes were linked to coat colour, spotting, or fur length, cosmetic traits that humans had only recently emphasised in the age of cat fancy. The rest of the genome looked remarkably wild. This has led scientists to argue that cats represent a case of self-domestication more than directed domestication. They were not rigorously bred by humans for specific tasks across millennia. Instead, they found a niche around our settlements, flourished as hunters of rodents, and tolerated our presence because it suited them. Humans occasionally rewarded friendliness, perhaps offering scraps or shelter, but most of the selective pressure came from the cat's own ability to exploit the human environment. When genome studies were compared across feral populations and pampered house pets, the differences were minimal. A feral cat in a city alley, with no contact with humans beyond scavenging, and a Persian curled on a sofa in London share almost the same genetic makeup. This resilience is unlike any other companion animal. One of the most striking findings of modern DNA work is how easily cats can revert. Release a domesticated dog into the wild, and it may survive for a time, but generations of breeding for dependence on humans usually leave it less capable in the long term. release cats, and within a generation they look and behave almost indistinguishably from their wild ancestors. Their hunting skills remain intact, their reproductive strategies unchanged, their ecological impact severe. This is why feral cat populations explode on islands or in cities when left unchecked. The genome tells us that little was fundamentally altered in their domestication. In truth, they are still wild animals that simply happen to tolerate our firesides. Geneticists studying mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal lineages, have confirmed a singular origin for all housecats, a small population of Felis sylvestris libica in the Fertile Crescent. Yet when those cats spread, they readily interbred with local wildcats in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Today, domestic cats and wildcats hybridize so freely that conservationists worry about the erosion of genetically pure wild populations in places like Scotland. The lack of strong barriers between wild and domestic lineages underscores just how porous the boundary remains. We may call our cats domesticated, but genetically they are still capable of merging seamlessly back into the wild pool. One area where subtle shifts do appear in the genome is in behaviour. Studies have identified small differences in genes linked to fear responses and social tolerance. Domestic cats are, on average, more willing to approach humans, to vocalise, and to tolerate proximity to other cats than wild libica. Even so, the changes are modest. Unlike dogs, who evolved entire repertoires of expressions, obedience behaviours, and cooperative instincts shaped by millennia of human preference, cats remain fundamentally solitary hunters. Their domestication was not about becoming pack members, but about learning to exist in the shadow of humans without conflict. In this sense, the genome confirms what many owners already know: cats live with us on their own terms. Modern genetics surveys have also revealed just how recent most visible variety in cats really is. The tabby stripes, orange coats, and pointed Siamese patterns that seem so central to our idea of cats are products of the last 1,000 years at most, with many stabilised only in the last 2 centuries through cat fancy breeding. The genome shows that for most of history, cats looked almost identical to their wild ancestors: mackerel tabby patterned, sandy or grey-brown, built for stealth. This underlines how shallow the human influence has been. We have barely scratched the surface of the genome compared to the wholesale remodelling we imposed on dogs or livestock. The haunting implication of this research is that cats may not be domesticated in the way we typically use the word. Instead, it may be more accurate to say that they domesticated themselves by exploiting the ecological niches humans created. They adapted just enough to live beside us, but retained the independence to live without us. Some scientists go further, suggesting that it is humans who are domesticated by cats, trained to provide food, shelter, and warmth in exchange for companionship that they dispense sparingly. This tongue-in-cheek reversal captures something real. Cats have spread to every continent on Earth, numbering in the hundreds of millions, not because humans intentionally bred them for work, but because humans found them too charming and too useful to resist. Genome projects continue to refine our understanding. In 2014, an international consortium released a more detailed sequence of the domestic cat genome, highlighting its close similarity to wildcats. By the 2020s, researchers were using comparative genomics to look at disease susceptibility, coat variation, and even neurological traits. One practical outcome has been a better understanding of genetic disorders in purebred cats, from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in Maine Coons to polycystic kidney disease in Persians. Yet in the grand scheme, these are recent side effects of cat fancy, not deep evolutionary changes. For the vast majority of cats worldwide, stray, feral, or household companions, the genome is still that of a desert hunter who found its way into human granaries 10,000 years ago. This leads to an uncomfortable but important question. If domestication implies dependence, then perhaps cats are only partially domesticated. They still feed themselves, still reproduce without our guidance, still slip back into feral states with ease. We provide comfort, but not necessity. And perhaps that is why they fascinate us. They are the only common pet that feels both ours and not ours at the same time. They accept our affection, but never entirely surrender their wildness. In their genome is written the story of autonomy preserved against the tide of human control. As we close this long journey from the first grain stores of the Fertile Crescent to genome labs of the modern age, the cat remains an enigma. It is not the pliant servant that the dog became, nor the engineered machine of the cow or the chicken. It is a creature that lives with us, not for us. Its genome whispers that it could leave us tomorrow and still survive, yet it stays. The haunting question is whether this long companionship says more about cats or about us. Did we domesticate them, or did they, in their quiet way, domesticate us? Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.